It was a crisp morning in downtown San Francisco, the kind of morning where the city hums with the usual energy. People hurried down busy streets, rushing to work, grabbing their morning coffee, and going about their daily lives, unaware of the chance encounter that was about to unfold. Among the crowd, one man stood out, a man whose name was known by millions across the globe. Steph Curry, the Golden State Warriors point guard and one of the NBA's biggest superstars. Steph was just finishing his morning practice at the Warriors training facility and was heading to a nearby cafe to grab a quick breakfast. He had an early game that evening, but his day was still wide open. He often took this time to walk around the city, clear his head, and enjoy the bustling streets of his hometown. Today, however, would be different. Today, he would cross paths with a man who would challenge everything he thought he knew about helping others. Steph was walking down Market Street when he noticed a figure sitting by the entrance of a small building, a man bundled in layers of worn-out clothes, a beanie pulled low over his face. It was Danny, a homeless man who had been living on the streets of San Francisco for years. His scruffy beard and ragged clothes were a stark contrast to the polished image of the celebrity walking past him. Danny had a sign next to him, the same one he had held for months. "Can you spare $1?" As Steph walked by, he felt a tug on his heart. He had seen countless homeless people before, but something about this man felt different. Maybe it was the way his eyes glistened, or how the deep lines on his face told a story of pain and loss. It wasn't just a passing glance. There was something about Danny that made Steph pause. "Hey, man," Danny called out, his voice rough but not without a hint of hope. "Can you give me $1?" Steph slowed his pace and turned to face the man. It was a simple request, one he had heard 1,000 times before. But something about the way Danny asked, with a mixture of vulnerability and weariness, made Steph stop in his tracks. For a moment, Steph stood there, staring at the man. In his world, $1 was hardly a thought. But what struck him wasn't just the request. It was the person behind it. Steph had grown up surrounded by luxury, fame, and wealth, but he had always prided himself on staying grounded. He had spent years giving back to the community, donating to charity, and volunteering, but here was something that made him question what it really meant to help. Without thinking, Steph reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet and began to take out a few bills. But as he did, something stopped him. Something inside told him that just handing over money wasn't enough. Was that really what Danny needed? Was that going to make any difference in his life? Danny watched with a mixture of expectation and resignation as Steph's hand hovered over the money. He had been on the streets for years, asking for help, receiving empty promises, and getting the occasional dollar or two. But deep down, he had learned not to expect much. Life had knocked him down, and he had learned to survive on the little that people gave him, even if it was just for a moment of comfort. Steph hesitated, his fingers still clutching the bill. He looked into Danny's eyes and saw something he wasn't expecting. Not just desperation, but a quiet strength. Danny wasn't asking for a handout. He wasn't begging. There was a dignity in his plea, a pride that Steph couldn't ignore. "What's your story, man?" Steph asked, putting the money back in his pocket. He had come to expect more from himself than just handing over a few dollars. There was something deeper here, something worth exploring. Danny blinked, caught off guard by the question. He had grown used to being ignored, to being invisible to the world that passed him by. But here was a man, one of the most famous athletes on the planet, asking him about his life. It wasn't just about the dollar anymore. Danny felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment could be different. It's a long story," Danny said, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "Used to be an artist, had a good life. But things fell apart. Lost my family, lost my job. Now, I just survive. I don't ask for much. Just trying to make it through another day." Steph knelt down, his eyes locked on Danny's, giving him his full attention. In the midst of his fast-paced, celebrity-filled life, this simple exchange felt like something that could change everything. "What happened? You said you were an artist?" Danny's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself talk. "I used to paint. I was pretty good, actually. But addiction, it took everything. Lost my wife, my kids. My art, It just became another thing I couldn't hold on to. Now, I don't even know who I am anymore." The words hung heavy between them. Steph felt a mix of empathy and frustration. He was used to being able to solve problems, on the court, with his team, in his community. But this felt different. This wasn't a game he could win with a last-second shot. This was real life, raw and unfiltered. "I'm sorry, man," Steph said, his voice soft. "But you're not alone, okay? People care. You're not invisible." Danny shook his head, a faint smile pulling at his lips. "I don't know, man. I don't know if anyone really cares anymore. I've been on my own for so long." Steph stood up, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on his ability to make a difference, whether through charity work or mentoring younger athletes. But here, in this moment, he didn't just want to give Danny $1. He didn't want this interaction to be fleeting. "Look, I don't have all the answers," Steph said, his voice firm. "But if you'll let me, I want to help. Not just with $1. I want to help you get back on your feet. Maybe we can figure something out." Danny's eyes widened, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You serious? Why would you help me?" "Because you're a person. And that's what people do for each other," Steph replied, his tone unwavering. And just like that, in the middle of the bustling streets of San Francisco, a life was about to change. But for both men, it was just the beginning of a journey they couldn't have anticipated. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story is just beginning, and it's about to get a lot more intense. What's one thing you've learned in your life that has pushed you forward even in your toughest moments? Before Steph Curry was known for his sharpshooting prowess on the basketball court, before his name became synonymous with NBA championships and three-point records, he was just a kid from Charlotte, North Carolina, with a dream. Born into a family of athletes, his destiny seemed inevitable. But Steph's journey to the top wasn't as smooth as people might think. It was filled with obstacles, self-doubt, and moments when the world didn't believe in him. Steph's father, Del Curry, had made a name for himself as an NBA player. He played for several teams throughout his career, but his most notable years were spent with the Charlotte Hornets. Steph grew up watching his father play professional basketball, and from an early age, he was exposed to the competitive, high-pressure environment of the NBA. But despite the seemingly perfect setup for an athletic career, Steph's path was anything but guaranteed. As a child, Steph wasn't the towering figure you'd expect of a future NBA star. In fact, he was often overlooked by scouts because of his height. At just 6 feet 2 inches, Steph wasn't the physical powerhouse that many players in the NBA were known for. He was lanky, with a slender build, and his shooting form was considered unconventional. As a high school player at Charlotte Christian, Steph wasn't initially the most sought-after recruit. His skill set was undeniable, but college scouts had their doubts. They weren't convinced he had what it took to make it at the highest level. Yet, Steph didn't let those doubts define him. He was determined to prove everyone wrong. He spent hours practicing, perfecting his shot, and working on his skills, not because he wanted to prove others wrong, but because he knew he had the potential to be something special. His high school coach, who saw the raw talent in him, became one of his biggest supporters. Together, they worked tirelessly to refine his game. Despite this, when it came time for college recruitment, many of the big schools passed on him. The blue-chip programs, like Duke, North Carolina, and others, weren't interested. Instead, Steph received an offer from Davidson College, a smaller school that many had never heard of. It wasn't the big stage, but it was a chance for Steph to show what he could do. Davidson became his proving ground. There, Steph would grow into the player everyone now knows. He led his team to an unexpected NCAA tournament run, taking down giants like Gonzaga and Georgetown. But it wasn't just his ability to score that made him stand out. It was his work ethic, his resilience, and his ability to rise to the occasion when the pressure was on. That's what made him different. It wasn't about being the biggest or the fastest. It was about heart. After his time at Davidson, Steph was drafted by the Golden State Warriors in 2009. At first, many questioned the choice. The Warriors had selected a skinny, slight guard from a mid-major school. Was this a risky pick? Could Steph really translate his success in college to the professional level? The answers came quickly, and they were clear. Steph's game translated perfectly. His ball handling, his passing, and, above all, his shooting made him a force to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just his talent that made him stand out. It was his mindset. Steph Curry had an unshakable belief in himself. No matter the odds, no matter how much the world doubted him, he always believed that he could rise above. It wasn't cockiness. It was faith. Faith in his work ethic. Faith in his ability to overcome. And that faith became the foundation for everything he accomplished. As his career progressed, Steph not only became a two-time MVP and led the Warriors to multiple championships, but he also became a role model. His humble nature and focus on giving back to his community set him apart from many athletes. He created initiatives aimed at providing education for underprivileged children, working on affordable housing projects, and helping young athletes chase their dreams, just like he had. But beyond the courts and the accolades, Steph's real source of strength came from his family. His mother, Sonia, had always been a pillar of support, and his wife, Aisha, had stood by him through thick and thin. They were his rock. It wasn't the fame or the money that drove him. It was the love and support from the people closest to him. Steph's relationship with his family and his deep sense of responsibility to his community were what kept him grounded. Even as his career soared to new heights, he never lost sight of what truly mattered. It's a mindset he carries with him every day, whether he's on the court or walking the streets of San Francisco. It's the same mindset that led him to pause and look at Danny, the homeless man sitting on the corner. It's the same mindset that made him stop, question, and wonder if there was more he could do than simply give $1. Steph's story was one of overcoming obstacles and proving the doubters wrong. But it was also one of learning that true success isn't just about winning games or setting records. It's about lifting others up along the way. And as he stood there, looking down at Danny, he realized that this moment, this chance encounter, could be a new chapter in his own journey of making a difference. Danny had been living on the streets for years. Once a promising artist, his life had taken an unexpected and tragic turn. The city that now seemed to ignore him had once been his canvas, a place of inspiration and opportunity. But over time, those opportunities had slipped through his fingers, leaving him stranded in a world of cold concrete and dark alleys. His story wasn't unlike many others who found themselves homeless in San Francisco, an unfortunate combination of loss, poor decisions, and a lack of support. He had once been married to a woman named Lisa, a fellow artist with whom he had built a life in the city. They had a small apartment in the Mission District, a cozy space filled with her paintings and his sculptures. Their dreams had been big, their love even bigger. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and it wasn't long before things started to unravel. It began with the loss of his job. Danny had been working as a freelance graphic designer, but the constant pressure to meet deadlines, the long hours at his computer, and the uncertainty of steady work took a toll on his mental health. He began drinking more to cope, and the drinking eventually turned into something darker. What started as a way to numb the stress of his failing career soon turned into an addiction he couldn't control. Lisa tried to help, tried to support him, but the relationship became strained. She couldn't watch the man she loved self-destruct, and she eventually made the heartbreaking decision to leave. Danny was devastated. His art, once his escape, now felt pointless. His addiction only deepened, and without the support of his wife, he found himself spiraling further into despair. One bad decision after another led to him losing his apartment. And just like that, his life had been turned upside down. The streets were a harsh reality. The first few nights were the worst. He'd find a corner, wrap himself in whatever jacket or blanket he could find, and try to sleep, hoping for a few hours of peace. But the city didn't care. It didn't care that he had once been someone with dreams and ambitions. In the eyes of passers-by, he was invisible. Just another person begging for change, another face that people avoided. For years, Danny had tried to survive by any means necessary. He'd find whatever work he could, picking up odd jobs, selling some of his old artwork, and sometimes, when the situation was dire, asking for spare change. He hated it. It wasn't the man he wanted to be, but it was the reality he was stuck in. Despite all of this, Danny wasn't a bitter man. Sure, he had moments of anger, especially when he thought about how his life had turned out. He'd often look around at the successful people passing by, wondering how they had it so easy. But he also knew that most of them didn't see him. He was just part of the background noise of the city, easily ignored and forgotten. But there was always a small flicker of hope inside him. He still dreamed of one day getting clean, of finding his way back to his art. Sometimes, when the sun hit the streets just right, he would look up at the sky and remember who he used to be, an artist, a lover, a man with a future. But those days felt distant, like a dream that had faded with time. This morning, though, something was different. As Danny sat near the entrance of a small building on Market Street, his stomach growling with hunger, he noticed a man walking toward him. At first, he thought nothing of it. The city was full of people rushing to work, tourists snapping pictures, and joggers out for their morning run. But then, as the man got closer, Danny realized something. This wasn't just any passerby. It was Steph Curry. Danny froze, unsure of what to do. For a moment, he just watched the famous NBA player walking toward him. His heart skipped a beat. Could it really be him? Steph Curry, the face of the Golden State Warriors, one of the most successful athletes in the world, was walking in his direction. The thought that crossed Danny's mind wasn't, wow, what a chance to meet him. No, it was something simpler, something more immediate. I wonder if he'll give me $1. That was the reality of life on the streets. You didn't expect much, but you hoped for something. $1, a meal, a small act of kindness. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about survival. Hey man, Danny called out, his voice rough from disuse. Can you give me $1? It wasn't an original line. He'd said it hundreds of times before to countless strangers who passed by. But there was something about today, something in the air that felt different. Maybe it was the way the sun was shining, or maybe it was the faint hope that this particular person might actually stop. Steph didn't just walk past. He slowed down. Danny could feel the pause. Most people would keep walking, maybe toss a coin in his direction if they even acknowledged him. But not Steph. He stopped, looked at Danny, and for the first time in a long while, Danny felt seen. He wasn't invisible. Steph's gaze lingered for a moment. The casual observer might have thought he was just about to offer some loose change and move on. But something in his expression told a different story. He didn't just see Danny as a homeless man. He saw him as a person. And in that split second, something stirred within him. A mix of empathy, curiosity, and perhaps something more. Without a word, Steph reached for his wallet. But as his fingers brushed against the bills inside, he hesitated. For a moment, he stood there, considering the man before him. Danny's face, his eyes, those eyes that seemed so tired, so worn, told a story. And that story was about more than just $1. Steph knew that giving Danny $1 wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't help him get his life back. It wouldn't address the root of the problem. And it certainly wouldn't make Danny feel less alone in a city that had largely forgotten people like him. So instead of handing over cash, Steph did something unexpected. He didn't just ask, "Are you okay?" He asked a deeper question, one that cut through the surface-level interactions of the city. "What's your story, man?" And in that moment, Danny didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being asked that. It wasn't just the question. It was the fact that someone important, actually cared enough to ask, to hear the truth. Danny had been on the streets long enough to know when a conversation was genuine, and this one felt different. Most people who stopped to talk to him had an agenda. Either they wanted to feel good about themselves by giving a few coins, or they simply didn't have time to listen to the story behind the request. But Steph Curry wasn't like that. His eyes held something more than just pity or fleeting interest. They held a question, a desire to understand, to know who Danny really was. Steph crouched down to Danny's level, positioning himself as a peer, not as someone looking down from above. It was a simple gesture, but for Danny, it meant the world. People rarely saw him as an equal. Most simply saw him as a homeless man in need of charity, a nameless face that was easy to ignore. But Steph wasn't looking past him. He was looking at him. Danny hesitated at first, unsure of how to respond. For years, he had become accustomed to silence, to the awkwardness of being avoided or given handouts without a word. But something in Steph's demeanor, his genuine curiosity, unlocked something deep within Danny. It had been a long time since he had told anyone his story, since he had shared the pain of his past. Used to be an artist, Danny began, his voice rough but steady. Had a life, had a family. I had everything, but I let it slip away. The addiction took over, and I couldn't control it. Lost my wife, my kids, my job, everything. Now, I'm just trying to make it through the day. Steph listened intently, his gaze never faltering. He could see the weight of the years on Danny's face, the sorrow that hung in the air between them. Danny wasn't just a homeless man asking for money. He was a man who had experienced loss, a man who had dreams once but was now living in a reality far from what he had imagined. Addiction's a tough thing, Steph said quietly, his voice filled with empathy. He wasn't just spouting words of comfort. He had seen addiction firsthand, not just in his community but in the lives of people he had worked with. I get it, but you're not alone, okay? You're not invisible. Danny blinked, taken aback by the words. He had heard plenty of people tell him he wasn't alone, but there was something different in the way Steph said it. It wasn't some empty platitude meant to make him feel better. It was a promise that he, Danny, was worth something more than the dollar he had asked for. I don't know where to go from here, Danny admitted, his voice breaking slightly. He hadn't planned on getting emotional, but there it was. The rawness of his pain, the years of pretending he was fine, finally breaking through. I don't know how to fix this. Steph sat back on his heels, considering his next words carefully. He had never been in Danny's shoes, but he knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel like you were fighting a battle you didn't know how to win. He had faced his own doubts, his own setbacks, especially early in his career when everyone told him he wasn't tall enough, wasn't strong enough to make it in the NBA. But he had kept going. He had found a way to rise, and he wanted Danny to know that he could rise, too. I don't have all the answers, Steph said honestly, his voice firm with conviction, but I believe in second chances. I believe in the possibility of change. You're still here, Danny. That means there's still hope. I want to help you find a way back. Not just with $1, but with real support. Let's see what we can do together. Danny's eyes widened as he processed the words. It wasn't just a kind offer, it was a lifeline. For the first time in years, Danny allowed himself to feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Steph didn't offer false promises or easy solutions. He didn't say that everything would be fixed overnight, but his offer was real. It wasn't just about giving a handout, it was about giving Danny a chance to rebuild, to rediscover the man he once was, and to step into a future where he could make a difference, not just for others, but for himself. Steph stood up, pulling out his phone. I know some people who can help. They've worked with folks who've gone through what you've gone through. I'll connect you with them. We'll figure this out together. Danny was speechless. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this kind of compassion, not from a celebrity, not from anyone really. But here was Steph Curry, the superstar who could have easily kept walking, offering him something more than $1. He was offering him a chance at a new life. As they exchanged contact information, Danny felt something shift inside him. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of light in a long, dark tunnel. For the first time in a long time, Danny felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too far gone. Steph smiled, clapping Danny on the shoulder before turning to leave. You've got this, man. We'll talk soon. Stay strong. Danny watched as Steph walked away, his footsteps fading into the crowd. The famous athlete disappeared into the sea of people, but the impact of that moment stayed with Danny. He stood there for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. It wasn't just the promise of help that stuck with him. It was the way Steph made him feel. Seen, valued, worth helping. And in that moment, Danny realized something. He wasn't just asking for $1. He was asking for a chance to be more than what his circumstances had made him. He was asking for dignity, and in return, he had been given a lifeline. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city, Danny felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. It was hope, but not the kind he used to wish for. This time, it was real. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and cautious optimism for Danny. After his conversation with Steph Curry, a part of him wanted to believe that change was possible. But the other part, The part that had been burned by disappointment so many times before was hesitant. It was easy to get excited when someone like Steph, a superstar, took an interest in you. But how many times had he been let down by promises from people who seemed to care, only to disappear when things got tough? But as each day passed, the flicker of hope inside him began to grow brighter. Steph had kept his word. He had connected Danny with a network of people who helped those struggling with addiction, homelessness, and mental health. He wasn't just offering a handout. He was offering a chance at transformation. One of the first calls Danny received was from a woman named Sarah. She worked with an organization that provided resources and support to people in situations like his. "Hi, Danny. I'm Sarah," she said in a calm, friendly tone. "I'm with a group that works with people who are looking to make a fresh start. I'd love to help you with that. We have rehab programs, housing assistance, job training. It's not easy, but it's a real shot at getting back on your feet." Danny sat there, stunned, listening to her words. This wasn't some temporary shelter or a charity meal. Sarah was talking about a program, a structured opportunity to rebuild his life. He had tried rehab before, tried to kick the addiction on his own, but it never worked. He had fallen into the same traps every time. But something about Sarah's voice, something about the sincerity in her words, made him think this time could be different. He had made the first step by simply talking to someone who didn't judge him, who didn't look at him like he was just another homeless guy asking for change. Now, he had to decide whether or not he was willing to put in the work. It wasn't an easy decision. Danny had lived on the streets for years. The weight of addiction, the trauma of his past, and the loneliness were heavy burdens to carry. Even the thought of change felt overwhelming. But every time he thought about the conversation with Steph, he remembered what the basketball star had said, "You're not invisible." That simple phrase had meant more than anything, more than any dollar or any fleeting act of kindness. It had planted the seed of belief in him that maybe, just maybe, he was worth fighting for. Danny took a deep breath. "Okay," he said finally. "I'm in." Sarah was overjoyed. "That's great, Danny. I'll send you the details of our intake process. We have a bed waiting for you, and we'll help you get started with the program right away. You don't have to do it alone." As Danny hung up the phone, a strange feeling washed over him. It was the first time in a long while that he felt something other than dread or resignation. For the first time in years, he felt like he had options. A future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. But it was a road, and for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. A few days later, Danny packed what little he owned into a small bag. He had a few clothes, a couple of old sketchbooks, and some art supplies he'd salvaged over the years. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had left. He stood on the corner of Market Street, waiting for a ride that Sarah had arranged for him. As he waited, he thought about everything that had led him to this moment. The mistakes, the regrets, the nights spent in cold alleyways. But he also thought about the conversation with Steph, about the possibility of a second chance. Steph had no obligation to help him. He could have simply handed him $1 and moved on with his day. But he hadn't. He had stopped. He had listened. And in doing so, he had reminded Danny that his story wasn't finished. It had just taken a new turn. The car arrived, a nondescript sedan with tinted windows, and Danny climbed inside. As they drove away from the familiar streets of downtown San Francisco, Danny glanced out the window at the city he had known for so long. It felt like he was leaving behind the old version of himself, the man who had given up, the man who had lost everything. But there was something else, too, a feeling that he was stepping into something new. The rehab facility was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, far from the noise and chaos of the streets. It felt different here, calm. It wasn't the kind of place that promised miracles, but it was a place where change could happen if you were willing to work for it. Danny was taken to a small room, simple but clean, with a bed and a desk. It wasn't a luxury hotel, but it felt like a palace compared to the sidewalks he had slept on. The first few days were tough. Danny went through the motions, therapy sessions, group meetings, and individual counseling. He wanted to believe it would work, but there was a part of him that remained skeptical. He was used to falling short. He was used to disappointment. But something about the way they treated him here, like he mattered, like he wasn't just a lost cause, kept him going. The staff was kind but firm, encouraging him when he made progress and pushing him when he stumbled. Sarah checked in regularly, always offering words of support, reminding him that he had made the hardest choice of all, that he had chosen to fight. It wasn't long before Danny began to feel a shift. It was small at first, a conversation with another resident about art, a breakthrough in his therapy session about why he had turned to addiction in the first place. But it was enough. It was enough to give him hope that he could find his way back. One evening, as Danny sat outside in the courtyard, sketching in his book, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen to see a message from Steph. "Hey, Danny. Just wanted to check in. How's everything going? Remember, one day at a time." For the first time, Danny smiled genuinely. It wasn't just because of the message. It was because he realized that someone who had every reason to forget him hadn't. He wasn't invisible anymore. And that, more than anything else, was what gave him the strength to keep moving forward. The first few weeks in the rehab facility felt like an emotional roller coaster for Danny. The mornings were filled with structured routines, starting with meditation and stretching exercises, followed by group therapy, where everyone gathered to talk about their experiences. At first, Danny resisted it. He didn't want to open up to strangers about the pain he had buried for so long. But as the days went by, he realized that the more he kept to himself, the more the weight of his past would suffocate him. Sarah had been right. There was something healing in talking about his story. The group didn't judge him. They understood. Each person had their own demons to wrestle with, their own battles to face. There was Mark, a former tech executive who had spiraled into addiction after losing his family in a car accident. There was Rachel, who had been struggling with substance abuse since her teenage years. And then there was Tim, an older man who had lived on the streets for decades before deciding that it was time for a change. Everyone in that room had their own version of a broken life, but they also shared something else, a desire to put the pieces back together. During one particular group session, Danny found himself listening more than speaking. The facilitator, a gentle man named Joe, asked each person to share their defining moment, the moment when they realized they needed to make a change. When it was Danny's turn, he hesitated. The words didn't come easily. I guess my moment came when I realized I wasn't just losing my life, Danny said, his voice cracking a little. I was losing my purpose. I was an artist once. I had dreams, a family. I let all of that go because I couldn't handle the pain. And now I'm just trying to figure out who I am without all that stuff. Without the addiction. Without the failure. The room was silent for a moment. Then Mark spoke up. I get it, man. I had everything too. House, family, career. But when that all fell apart, I didn't know who I was without the job, without the success. We all have to find something deeper than that. Something that's ours and ours alone. Danny nodded, feeling the truth of Mark's words sink in. He didn't have to be an artist to have a purpose. He didn't have to have the life he once had to be valuable. There was a chance for him to rebuild, not just his life, but himself. Over the next few weeks, Danny kept his head down and worked hard at the program. Every day felt like a small victory. He woke up early, ate the meals provided by the facility, and followed the schedule without fail. But there were still hard moments. The cravings for alcohol would sometimes hit him like a wave, drowning him in memories of the times he'd self-medicated to escape his pain. He still missed Lisa. He still missed the life he had once known. But every time those thoughts crept up, he reminded himself of one thing. He was here. He was still breathing. And he had a chance. It wasn't easy. Recovery was never going to be easy. But there were moments of peace, moments of clarity, that made the struggle feel worth it. During one of his counseling sessions, Danny had an epiphany. He had spent so much time focusing on what he had lost that he had forgotten to think about what he could still gain. His dreams didn't have to be in the past. They could still be in the future. One evening, as he was sketching in the courtyard again, Danny felt a surge of inspiration. It wasn't the usual kind of inspiration, the kind that came with being in a quiet studio surrounded by paint and canvases. No, this was raw, unfiltered, an urgency to create. He grabbed a piece of paper from his bag and started sketching the images in his mind, his hand moving quickly, almost instinctively. It wasn't a masterpiece. It wasn't even something he'd want to show anyone, but it was his. It was the first piece of art he'd created in months, The first time he had truly felt connected to his passion since everything had fallen apart. As he looked at the sketch, a quiet sense of accomplishment settled over him. He wasn't finished yet. He wasn't whole, but he was on his way. One of the most difficult parts of recovery for Danny was facing the people he had hurt during his time in addiction. His relationship with Lisa, his ex-wife, had never fully healed. There were too many unsaid words, too many years of emotional distance. She had tried to help him, tried to support him through his darkest days, but eventually, she had given up, leaving him with nothing but regret. One afternoon, as Danny was sitting in the common room, Sarah came over to him with a phone in her hand. "Danny, I know it's been a long time since you've talked to Lisa, but I spoke with her this morning. She's open to meeting, if you're ready." The mention of Lisa's name hit Danny like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard from her in years. He hadn't expected her to ever reach out again, not after everything that had happened. But Sarah was right. This was a chance to heal, to make amends, if nothing else. After a long pause, Danny nodded slowly. "I'm ready." The next few days felt like a blur as Danny prepared for the meeting. He was nervous, unsure of what he would say or how Lisa would react. But he knew one thing. He needed to face the mistakes he had made. He needed to take responsibility for the person he had been and show Lisa that he was working to be someone better. The day of the meeting arrived, and Danny found himself sitting in a small cafe near the rehab center, waiting for Lisa to arrive. His heart pounded in his chest, but he reminded himself that this wasn't about begging for forgiveness. This was about owning his mistakes and showing her that he was serious about changing. When Lisa walked in, Danny stood up. She looked different, older, of course, but also stronger, more confident. She hadn't changed much in appearance, but there was a calmness about her that Danny hadn't seen in years. "Hi, Danny," she said softly, taking a seat across from him. "Hi, Lisa," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know I don't deserve it, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. For everything. For the hurt I caused you. For the lies. For being someone I wasn't." Lisa took a deep breath, her eyes softening. "I know you're sorry, Danny. I can see that you're trying. But it's going to take time. You have to prove to yourself that you can change before you can prove it to anyone else. But I do want you to know that I'm proud of you. You're doing the right thing." The weight of those words hit Danny hard. She wasn't offering him a chance to pick up where they left off, but she was offering him something even more important, hope for the future. The days were starting to blend together for Danny, each one feeling like a small victory in the ongoing struggle to put his life back together. He had committed himself to the program at the rehab center, and though every step was hard, there was a quiet strength beginning to grow in him. It wasn't the dramatic, life-altering transformation he'd once hoped for, but it was real. It was steady. And for the first time in years, Danny felt like he was living with purpose again. The meeting with Lisa had been a turning point. It hadn't magically fixed everything, but her acknowledgement of his progress had given him the sense of validation he hadn't known he was missing. It was a reminder that the road to healing wasn't just about fixing his own mistakes, but also about allowing others to see the change in him, to recognize the effort he was making to become a better version of himself. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Danny received the text from Sarah. The message was simple. "I have a new opportunity for you. Call me when you can." His heart raced as he read the words. Was this the chance he had been waiting for? Was this the next step toward his future? He grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah's number immediately. "Hey, Danny. I've got some good news," Sarah's voice crackled through the line. "There's an art program that's just opened up at a local gallery. They're looking for someone to help with their exhibits, organizing art shows, and assisting the artists who are coming through. It's a chance for you to get back into the art world, even if it's not quite in the way you imagined. What do you think?" Danny's chest tightened. An art program? The thought of stepping back into that world, his world, after everything he had been through was both exhilarating and terrifying. Could he really do this? Could he put his trust back into the thing that had once given him so much joy, but had also led to his downfall? He took a moment to breathe. "I'm interested. Tell me more." Sarah explained that the gallery was looking for someone with experience in the arts, someone who could help facilitate the exhibits and also interact with other artists, giving them the kind of support and attention they needed. It wasn't exactly a full-time position, but it was a paid opportunity to get his foot back in the door, a small chance to rebuild the career he had lost. It's a start, Danny. Just a start. But it's a chance to reconnect with your passion, Sarah said, her voice steady and encouraging. Danny felt the weight of the decision settle over him. He wasn't ready to jump back into a full-time career in art yet, not with everything still fragile. But this was a step, a small, manageable step forward. And if he was truly going to move forward, he had to take it. Okay, I'm in, he said, his voice steady but with a quiet excitement underneath. Let's do this. The next day, Danny made his way to the gallery. It was a sleek, modern space tucked in a quiet part of the city, the kind of place where his work had once been showcased before the darkness of addiction had stolen it all away. As he entered, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Awe, nervousness, and hope. He had stood in galleries like this before, as an artist, as someone whose work mattered. But now, he was standing there as a man trying to rebuild, trying to prove to himself that he still had a place in the world of art. The gallery director, a woman named Clara, greeted him with a warm smile. You're Danny, right? Sarah told me you'd be joining us. We're really excited to have someone with your experience. We'll start small, but I think you'll be a great fit. As they walked through the space, Clara explained the ins and outs of the program. There were various exhibits coming up in the next few months, and Danny would be working alongside the artists to help set up their displays, arrange their works, and handle the logistics of each show. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important work. Work that allowed Danny to immerse himself in the world of art again without the pressure of being the artist on display. For the first time in a long while, Danny felt a spark of excitement. It wasn't about the fame or the recognition. It was about rediscovering his love for creation, for the process of making something that mattered. It felt like he was being given a second chance to fall in love with the craft again. Not as a career, but as a way to heal. As the weeks passed, Danny began to immerse himself more and more in the gallery work. He was up early in the mornings, organizing supplies, hanging paintings, arranging sculptures, and talking to artists about their work. It wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. The work gave him a sense of purpose beyond his recovery. He was contributing to something bigger than himself, something that felt important, and the more he worked, the more he found himself sketching again. At first, it was just quick doodles during lunch breaks, simple sketches inspired by the art he was surrounded by every day. But soon, the sketches began to evolve. He found himself drawing landscapes, abstract pieces, and even portraits of the people he had met along the way. His art had always been a reflection of his emotions, his journey. And now, as he was beginning to rebuild, his work reflected that transformation. One afternoon, as he was sketching a scene outside the gallery, Clara stopped by his table. Danny, I've been meaning to ask you something. We have a new exhibit opening next month. Would you consider showing some of your work? It doesn't have to be a big show, just a small part of the exhibit. We've got a space for new artists, and I think your work would fit really well. Danny blinked, stunned by the offer. A show? His work? It was almost too much to process. He hadn't shown his art to anyone in years, and the thought of doing so felt both thrilling and terrifying. I don't know if I'm ready, Danny admitted, his voice shaking a little. Clara smiled gently. You don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing. And I think that's exactly what you're doing, Danny. You're willing to try. And that's all we need. As Danny walked home that night, he thought about the offer. He wasn't sure if he was truly ready to show his work, but he knew one thing. It was time to start believing in himself again. Maybe this was what he had been working toward all along. Not just the recovery, but the opportunity to rediscover who he was, not just as a man in recovery, but as an artist too. The next morning, Danny made a decision. He would show his work. It wasn't about whether it was perfect or whether it would be a success. It was about taking that next step, about showing the world, and himself, that he was more than his past, more than his mistakes. He was an artist. He always had been. The weeks leading up to the art exhibit felt like a whirlwind for Danny. What had started as a quiet opportunity to get back into the art world had grown into something bigger, something he hadn't expected. The idea of showing his work to the public, of allowing others to see his art, was both thrilling and terrifying. But with Clara's encouragement and the steady progress he had made in his recovery, Danny found himself making choices that he never thought possible just a few months ago. He spent countless hours in the gallery, perfecting his pieces for the show. The once distracted man who had only been able to scrawl out fleeting images in his sketchbook now focused intently on his work. Each brushstroke and pencil line felt like a reclamation of the life he had lost. His art became a form of therapy, an expression of everything he was processing: the emotions, the pain, the victories, and the small steps toward healing. The night before the opening of the exhibit, Danny felt a rush of nerves. He hadn't shown anyone his art in years, not since he'd let his addiction consume his passion and creativity. Now, here he was, about to have a small piece of his soul displayed for strangers to see. That evening, he found himself sitting in his small apartment above the rehab center, looking at the pieces he had completed for the show. Each one told a different part of his story. One piece, a dark, abstract portrait, captured the chaos he had felt during his lowest moments. Another, a serene landscape of a lake at dawn, reflected the peace he was starting to find in his recovery. And then there was a portrait of a young man looking into a cracked mirror, symbolizing his fractured identity and the journey toward wholeness. He knew that people would look at these paintings, these representations of his pain and growth, and wonder who this man was, what story his art had to tell. He hadn't done it for fame or recognition. He had done it because he had to. Art was the language he could speak when words failed. The night of the exhibit arrived, and Danny stood at the entrance of the gallery, his heart pounding. The lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows across the sleek white walls. People milled around, sipping wine and chatting as they observed the art displayed in front of them. Some were artists, others art enthusiasts, but all were there for one reason: to experience something new, something different. Clara was there, of course, greeting guests and making introductions. She had been a constant source of support for Danny throughout this process, reminding him that his work didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be real. When the first group of visitors approached his artwork, Danny felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. They were staring at his pieces, his personal story, without knowing him, without knowing the battles he had fought to get to this point. His hands trembled slightly, but he reminded himself that this was part of the journey. The act of showing his work wasn't just about gaining approval. It was about expressing his truth. A woman stepped up to the portrait of the young man in front of the cracked mirror. Her eyes softened as she took in the image. "This is powerful," she said quietly, turning to the person next to her. "It speaks to me on so many levels. I can see the pain, but I can also feel the strength in it." Danny exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't the kind of validation he had expected, but it was the kind he needed. It wasn't praise for being a perfect artist. It was acknowledgement of the truth he had poured into his work. As the night wore on, more people stopped to look at his paintings. Some asked questions. Some simply nodded in appreciation. Danny could feel a sense of connection growing between himself and the people who were experiencing his art. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, truly seen, for who he was, not for what he had been. At one point during the evening, as Danny was standing near one of his paintings, Clara approached him with a glass of wine in hand. "You did it, Danny," she said with a warm smile. "You really did it." Danny smiled back, a little overwhelmed by the evening's events. "I didn't expect it to feel like this. I thought I'd be nervous, but it's different now. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I just want them to understand what this represents." Clara nodded. "That's exactly why it works. When you create from a place of honesty, people connect with that. They see the authenticity, and that's what makes your work meaningful." As the night continued, Danny found himself relaxing more, enjoying the quiet conversations with people who admired his art. He even met a few local artists who expressed interest in collaborating with him in the future. The gallery exhibit had already turned into something bigger than he had imagined. A new beginning, not just for his career, but for his life. The next morning, Danny woke up early, his mind still buzzing with the events of the previous evening. The rush of adrenaline had faded, but something else lingered, a sense of peace. The fear that had once paralyzed him had been replaced with a quiet confidence. He had faced one of his biggest fears, exposing his art, his vulnerability, to the world, and he had come through it stronger. As he walked to the rehab center for his morning therapy session, he couldn't help but think back to his conversation with Steph Curry months ago. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the words that had been spoken in that brief encounter still resonated in his heart. "You're not invisible." Steph's words had been the spark that ignited Danny's journey toward recovery. But tonight, as he stood surrounded by the work he had poured his soul into, Danny realized that he wasn't just seen by others. He had begun to see himself again, too. The weeks that followed the exhibit felt surreal to Danny. What had once seemed like a small step into the unknown had grown into something more profound than he could have imagined. The response to his artwork had exceeded his expectations. People were talking about his work, discussing its emotional depth, its raw honesty. Clara, ever the supportive mentor, had even received offers from galleries that wanted to showcase more of his art. It was the kind of recognition he hadn't dared to dream about during the darkest days of his addiction. But with success came pressure. Pressure to keep up, to prove that this was not just a fluke, that he wasn't going to fall back into the chaos he had left behind. Every time Danny thought about his next steps, he felt a tug of anxiety. Was he truly ready to embrace this new version of himself? Or was he just a man teetering on the edge, waiting to fall back into the same habits that had once destroyed him? It wasn't just the professional pressure that weighed on him. It was the personal struggle, too. As much as he had been working hard to rebuild his life, he couldn't ignore the constant shadow of his past. He still battled the lingering thoughts of self-doubt, the memories of his failures, the sense that he would always be defined by the mistakes he had made. No matter how much progress he made, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the fear that he wasn't worthy of this second chance. One afternoon, as he was organizing some new pieces at the gallery, Clara stopped by with a thoughtful look on her face. She had been busy with other projects, but Danny could always sense when something was on her mind. "I've been thinking about something, Danny," she said as she stood beside him, glancing at one of his latest sketches. "You've made such incredible progress, but I want to ask you something important. How are you really doing? I know you're working hard, and things are going well here, but recovery is more than just showing up. It's about taking care of yourself on a deeper level." Danny paused, surprised by the question. He had been so focused on the outward success, the new exhibits, the compliments, the opportunities, that he hadn't really stopped to think about how he was feeling inside. Clara had always been direct, but her words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm doing okay, I guess," he replied, hesitating. "I mean, I'm back to creating, and things are looking up. But I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm just waiting for something to go wrong. Like I'm still not good enough, still not enough to really keep this going." Clara's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Danny, this is the part of recovery where the work really starts. You've done so much to get here, but there will always be moments when you question your worth. The key is to not let those doubts control you. You are worthy of this success, and you are more than the sum of your past mistakes. You just need to keep moving forward, one step at a time." Her words resonated deeply within him, and for the first time in a while, Danny felt the weight of his progress. He wasn't just creating art. He was creating a new life, a life that was built on a foundation of recovery, self-worth, and resilience. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to keep moving forward. Despite the success, Danny still found himself wrestling with the temptation to numb the pain, to retreat back into the escape of addiction. There were days when the stress felt overwhelming, when the pressure to be someone he wasn't sure he could be felt too heavy. But he also knew that he couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything he had worked for. He had come too far to let the past pull him under again. It was during one of these tough days that Danny found himself sitting in a quiet corner of the rehab center, staring at the small sketchbook he always carried with him. He had begun to draw again, but this time, the sketches weren't just about art. They were about him, his journey, his growth, his internal battles. In each line, each shading, Danny began to map out the person he was becoming. He wasn't defined by his past. He wasn't defined by his mistakes or the things he had done to hurt others. He was defined by the choices he made today, by the person he was working to become. And in that moment, as his pencil moved across the page, Danny realized that he had something truly valuable, something he had almost lost forever: hope. One evening, after a long day of work at the gallery, Danny decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city streets. As he walked through the quiet neighborhoods, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed in the past few months. The man who had once stood on the street corner, begging for spare change, was now a man who had found a way to rebuild his life. The contrast between the man he had been and the man he was becoming was stark, and yet, it was also beautiful. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was Sarah. "Hey, Danny. How's everything going?" "I'm good," Danny said, smiling as he sat on a bench near the park. "Really good. The gallery's been great, and the exhibit's getting some attention. But I've been thinking about something, about how much I've changed and how much I still need to grow." Sarah's voice was warm and supportive. "That's exactly where you should be. Recovery isn't about being perfect, it's about progress. And I'm proud of you, Danny. You've come so far." Danny leaned back against the bench, feeling the cool breeze on his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly where this journey would take him. But for the first time, he was okay with not knowing. He was ready to let go of the fear, the doubt, and just trust the process. "I'm proud of me too," Danny said softly, his voice steady. "I'm proud of who I'm becoming." The following days were filled with new opportunities and challenges. Danny continued to push forward, not just in his art, but in every aspect of his recovery. He spoke at group therapy, sharing his experiences with others who were struggling with addiction, offering them the hope that he had once lacked. He reached out to his family, beginning to rebuild the relationships he had neglected, one step at a time. And, most importantly, he kept creating, kept pouring his soul into his art, knowing that each brushstroke was another step toward healing. As the months passed, Danny's life seemed to be on an upward trajectory. His work was getting noticed, his relationships were mending, and he was continuing to put in the effort needed to stay on track with his recovery. The gallery had offered him more opportunities, and Clara had been instrumental in helping him connect with new networks of artists. He was starting to see a future that wasn't defined by his past mistakes, a future that felt full of potential. But as things began to improve, Danny couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. There were nights when the quiet was too loud, when his thoughts turned dark and self-doubting. What if it all fell apart? What if, in the midst of all this progress, he lost his way again? The fear of failure had always been a shadow over his life, but now, with so much to lose, it seemed to loom larger than ever. One evening, after a particularly successful opening at the gallery, Danny found himself in a familiar place. Alone in his apartment, sitting in the dim light of his living room, staring at the walls. His phone lay on the coffee table, and the faint sounds of the city outside seemed distant and muffled. The night was calm, but his mind was anything but. He had just finished a phone call with his mother, who had told him how proud she was of the changes he had made. He had heard those words many times before, but tonight, they felt different. For the first time, he truly believed them. But even as he basked in the pride of his accomplishments, a voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if you lose it all?" Danny stood up and paced around his apartment, his hands running through his hair in frustration. The fear of slipping back into the darkness was almost paralyzing. It felt like the higher he climbed, the further the fall would be. The next day, Danny met up with Clara at the gallery to discuss future exhibits. She could sense the tension in him immediately. "You've been quiet lately," Clara said, her tone casual but with an underlying concern. "Is everything okay?" Danny hesitated, unsure how to put his feelings into words. He had grown accustomed to sharing parts of his journey with her, but this was different. This fear felt personal, too raw, too deep to share easily. "I don't know, Clara," he said finally. "I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, going to therapy, working on my art, staying sober. But there's this part of me that feels like I'm waiting for something to go wrong. Like I don't deserve all this success. I'm scared that it's just going to slip through my fingers." Clara studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You're afraid of failing again, aren't you?" Danny nodded, his chest tight. "Yeah, I don't know how to shake it off. Every time something goes well, I feel like I'm just one mistake away from losing everything." Clara's gaze softened. "Danny, recovery is about progress, not perfection. It's about taking it one day at a time. You don't have to have everything figured out right now, and you don't have to worry about every potential setback. What matters is that you keep moving forward." Danny sighed, trying to absorb her words. "It's just hard, you know? To not feel like I'm constantly on the edge, like any wrong move will send me back to where I started." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You've come so far. You're not where you started, and you're stronger than you think. The fear will always be there, Danny. It's part of the journey, but you've got the tools now. You've got the support, and most importantly, you've got the determination to keep going." That night, as Danny sat alone in his apartment, he reflected on Clara's words. He knew she was right. He had come a long way, further than he ever thought possible, but the fear still gripped him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, reminding him of the darkness he had left behind. In an attempt to calm his mind, Danny picked up his sketchbook, the one that had become his constant companion throughout his journey. As his pencil moved across the page, he drew not just images, but emotions, the fear, the doubt, the hope. His art had always been a reflection of his inner world, and tonight, it became a way for him to process the turmoil he felt inside. He sketched a figure standing on a cliff, looking out over a vast, uncertain horizon. The figure was small, but strong, its posture determined. Below it, the sea churned, wild and untamed, symbolizing the chaos of his past. And yet, the figure stood tall, unmoving against the storm. It was a simple drawing, but it encapsulated everything he felt: the fear, the uncertainty, and yet the resilience. He wasn't where he once was, lost in the abyss. He was standing at the edge, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that even if the storm raged around him, he had the strength to weather it. The next day, Danny shared the drawing with Clara. She studied it for a moment, then looked up at him with a smile. "That's powerful," she said quietly. "It's like you're reminding yourself that the journey is bigger than any one moment of fear. You're standing on the edge, but you're not falling. You're moving forward." Danny nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time in a while, the fear seemed a little less overpowering. He wasn't just fighting his past, he was embracing his future. And while the fear would always be there, it no longer had to define him. The following weeks were filled with more challenges, both big and small. Danny continued to wrestle with his self-doubt, but he also learned to lean on his support system when the weight of fear became too much. He attended therapy more regularly, reached out to old friends, and focused on the art that had given him so much strength. And slowly, as he continued to make progress, he began to understand something important. Fear was not his enemy. It was simply a part of the journey, a reminder that he was alive, that he cared, that he was pushing himself to grow. It had been a few weeks since the gallery opening, and Danny was finally starting to feel a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The fear of falling back into old habits still lingered in the corners of his mind, but he had learned how to manage it. It was no longer a daily battle. He had developed a routine, a combination of therapy, art, and time spent with Clara that helped him stay grounded. The constant pressure to prove himself was starting to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from doing the work day by day. As his art continued to gain recognition, Danny was approached by a few new opportunities. One gallery in particular wanted to feature a solo exhibition of his work. The thought was both exciting and overwhelming. He had never envisioned himself as a star in the art world, but here he was, being asked to headline a show of his own. It felt surreal, like a dream he hadn't allowed himself to believe in. But with each new opportunity came a new set of questions. Was he ready for this? Could he handle the pressure of being in the spotlight, with more people watching him, more expectations placed on him? Could he trust that he wasn't just a temporary success, a flash in the pan? One morning, Danny sat in the park with Clara, sharing his concerns over a cup of coffee. The park was peaceful, with the sun shining through the trees and the sounds of the city faint in the background. It was moments like this, simple and quiet, that reminded him of how far he had come. Clara, I don't know if I can do it. A solo show. It feels like too much, he confessed, his voice heavy with uncertainty. I'm not sure I'm ready for all that comes with it. Clara leaned back, her expression calm but thoughtful. Danny, you've already done the hard work. The hardest part was getting here. Facing your fears, your past, your addiction. The success that's coming to you now is a result of that work. It's not about being ready for a solo show. It's about trusting that you've already earned it. Danny listened to her words carefully. It was hard to believe that he had earned this success, that he truly deserved the opportunities that were coming his way. But Clara's faith in him had been a constant throughout his recovery, and he realized that maybe it was time to trust her, and trust himself, too. Do you think people will believe in me? He asked, almost as if he were asking for permission. Danny, Clara said, her voice firm but gentle, people are already believing in you. You're the one who needs to start believing in yourself. Over the next few days, Danny allowed himself to lean into the possibility of the solo show. He took it one step at a time, not thinking too much about the pressures, but focusing instead on the excitement of presenting his work. It wasn't just about the recognition. It was about what his art represented, the journey he had been on, the battles he had fought, and the person he was becoming. He realized that his work was a reflection of him, and showing it to the world was not about impressing anyone. It was about sharing his truth. Clara helped him prepare for the show, offering guidance on how to present the pieces and how to speak about them to potential buyers and art critics. She was an expert in the art world, but more than that, she understood Danny. She knew how to push him just enough without overwhelming him. I've been thinking about your piece with the cracked mirror, Clara said one day as they stood in the gallery, arranging the pieces for the show. I think it'll resonate with a lot of people. It's raw, it's vulnerable, but it's also hopeful. People are going to connect with that. Danny smiled, looking at the painting she was referring to. It was one of his most personal pieces, a portrait of a man staring at a broken reflection in a mirror. It had taken him weeks to finish, not because it was technically difficult, but because it required him to confront parts of himself he wasn't sure he was ready to face. I wasn't sure if I should include it, Danny admitted. It's so personal. Exactly, Clara replied, her voice soft but confident. That's what makes it powerful. It's a piece of you, and that's what people will respond to. The night of the solo show arrived, and the gallery was buzzing with excitement. It was a small event, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if people knew they were witnessing something special. Danny had spent the last few days preparing, ensuring that each piece was positioned just right, and now, as he stood in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by his work, he could feel a mix of emotions: nervousness, excitement, and a sense of pride. The guests arrived slowly at first, but by the time the night was in full swing, the gallery was packed. There were artists, critics, and collectors, all of them there to see what Danny had created. It was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. For the first time, he wasn't just an artist struggling to stay afloat. He was a real part of the art world, a man who had something to say. People stopped in front of his paintings, murmuring to one another, appreciating the detail, the emotion, the honesty in his work. Danny stood in the corner of the room, watching from a distance. It was strange, this feeling of being both invisible and deeply seen at the same time. At one point, a woman approached him, her expression thoughtful as she studied one of his paintings. I have to say, I've never seen anything like this before, she said, her voice full of admiration. Your work is so vulnerable, yet so strong. There's a depth to it that really moves me. Danny felt a warmth spread through him at her words, and for a brief moment, the fear that had plagued him disappeared. He wasn't just some man showing off his art. He was an artist sharing his soul, and people were responding to that. As the night went on, more people approached him, complimenting his work, asking questions, and discussing the meaning behind his pieces. It wasn't about the sales or the fame. It was about the connection. People were seeing his journey through his art, and in that, Danny found something far more valuable than anything he had ever hoped for. When the night finally came to a close, Clara approached him with a proud smile. "You did it, Danny. They loved your work." Danny's heart swelled with emotion, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe it. He had done it. He had faced his fears, his doubts, and his insecurities, and had come out on the other side stronger. "You were right," Danny said quietly, looking at the people still lingering in the gallery. "I didn't need to be ready. I just needed to trust that I had earned this." Clara gave him a knowing smile. "And you did. You earned it every step of the way." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Sometimes, the hardest step is simply trusting that you're ready for what's ahead. What's one moment in your life where you had to take a leap of faith? Danny's solo exhibition had been a resounding success. The gallery had sold several pieces, and even more importantly, the critics had praised his work for its emotional depth and raw vulnerability. It was a validation he hadn't known he needed, proof that his journey, though filled with hardship and doubt, had been worth it. But with success came new expectations, and as the weeks passed, Danny began to feel the weight of those expectations pressing down on him. It wasn't just the pressure of creating more art, though that was certainly a part of it. It was the subtle shift in the way people saw him. At first, he had been the underdog, the man with a troubled past trying to make something of himself. But now, he was an artist with a reputation to uphold. People no longer just saw him as Danny, the guy who used to struggle with addiction. They saw him as a professional, a success story. And while that was flattering, it also made him feel like he was constantly on display, as if every move he made would be scrutinized. The more Danny thought about it, the more the pressure began to feel suffocating. He was used to being overlooked, to being invisible. But now, with the spotlight on him, it was harder to hide his vulnerabilities. He wasn't sure if he could keep up with the image that others had started to project onto him. Was he really as strong as they thought? Or was he just playing the part? One evening, as Danny sat in his studio, working on a new piece, he couldn't help but notice the growing sense of exhaustion that had settled in his chest. He had always been a night owl, but lately, even his late-night sessions in the studio felt draining. The creative spark that had once fueled him was starting to dim. He was struggling to produce work that felt authentic, as if the pressure to replicate his success was stifling his creativity. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Hey, just wanted to check in. How are you doing? Been thinking about you a lot lately." Danny stared at the screen for a moment, wondering if he should respond. He hadn't spoken to Sarah much since the exhibition. There had been a few messages here and there, but nothing significant. She had been supportive throughout his recovery, but now that his life seemed to be moving forward in a way he hadn't expected, he wasn't sure how to fit her back into the picture. After a moment of hesitation, he typed back, "I'm good, just a bit tired. Been working a lot lately. How about you?" Sarah's reply came quickly. "Tired? Huh? Sounds like someone needs a break. We should grab coffee soon. You deserve it." Danny smiled at the message. Despite everything, Sarah had always known how to cut through his defenses. She saw through the facade he'd built up, and sometimes that was exactly what he needed. Maybe it was time to let someone in again, to stop pretending that everything was perfect. The following weekend, Danny met Sarah at a small cafe downtown. The air was crisp, with autumn leaves swirling around their feet as they sat down outside, the sunlight casting a warm glow over everything. It was the kind of morning that made Danny feel like he could breathe a little easier. Sarah was the first to speak, her eyes scanning him with a knowing look. "You don't have to pretend with me, Danny. I know things aren't as perfect as they seem." Danny sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that I'm pretending. It's just a lot, you know? I didn't expect all this. The art, the shows, the people wanting to work with me. It's been great, but it's also kind of overwhelming." "I get that," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "You've come so far, and I'm proud of you. But you don't have to carry it all on your own." Danny leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't realized how much he had been trying to shoulder alone. For so long, he had relied on himself, his willpower, his determination. But now, with everything he had achieved, he was beginning to feel like he was losing control. He was so focused on keeping up the image of success that he was forgetting to take care of himself. I guess I've been pushing myself harder than I thought, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I'm afraid that if I slow down, I'll lose everything I've worked for. I keep telling myself that if I just keep going, I'll make it, but I'm not sure anymore what making it even means. Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. You don't have to be perfect, Danny, and you don't have to do it all at once. It's okay to take a step back and focus on what matters most. Danny stared at her for a moment, as if seeing her for the first time in a while. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to truly consider what mattered beyond the work, beyond the expectations. The truth was, he had been so consumed with proving himself that he had forgotten what it felt like to live freely, without the weight of ambition constantly pressing down on him. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of this. Need to prove myself, he said softly. It feels like if I stop trying so hard, everything will fall apart. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, Sarah replied. You've come so far, and you're allowed to enjoy this success. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You can't pour from an empty cup. The conversation lingered with Danny for the rest of the week. He had always been a perfectionist, always striving for more, never satisfied with what he had. It was a part of who he was, a part of the drive that had pulled him out of his darkest days. But now, as he looked at his life, his career, his relationships, his recovery, he realized that this constant pressure to be more, to achieve more, wasn't sustainable. It was draining him, making him lose sight of the very things that had helped him heal in the first place. That night, as he worked on a new piece in his studio, Danny found himself at a crossroads. The work he had been doing felt hollow, as if he was trying to capture something that wasn't there. His heart wasn't in it. He couldn't keep working like this, constantly chasing success at the expense of his peace of mind. He had to find a new balance, one that allowed him to grow without losing himself in the process. He closed his sketchbook and sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. It was time for a change, time to redefine what success meant to him, not as the world saw it, but as he felt it. He wasn't just an artist. He was a person, a man on a journey, and that journey was just as important as the work itself. Danny's decision to step back from the relentless pursuit of success was harder than he had imagined. It was one thing to say he wanted to change the way he approached his career, but it was another thing entirely to actually do it. The pressure from the art world, the expectations of those around him, and the constant desire to prove himself still lingered, hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. But as Danny spent more time reflecting on his choices, he began to understand that his true challenge wasn't just about creating art. It was about creating a life that he was proud of, both as an artist and as a person. The first step in this new direction was taking some time off from the studio. Danny hadn't given himself a true break in months, not since the solo exhibition. He had been working nonstop, creating new pieces for potential clients, attending meetings with gallery owners, and pushing himself to meet expectations that were set by others, not by himself. But now, in the quiet of his apartment, Danny realized that he needed to rediscover why he started creating art in the first place. It had never been about the fame or the accolades. It had been about the way art allowed him to process the world, to make sense of his experiences, and to heal. He reached out to Clara and told her he needed a few weeks to refocus, to clear his mind. Clara was understanding, as always, though she seemed concerned. She had been his biggest supporter, and while she understood his need for space, she also knew that Danny was the type to push himself to extremes. She didn't want him to disappear into his own thoughts without any guidance. I get it, Danny, she had said over the phone, but promise me one thing. You're not disappearing for good. If you need time to recharge, that's fine. But remember, you've built something here. Don't let the fear of losing it all hold you back. Danny promised her that he wouldn't isolate himself, but he knew that he needed time to disconnect from the constant hustle of the art world. He had been so focused on achieving external success that he had lost sight of what really mattered: his inner peace, his relationships, and his passion for art itself. The first few days were harder than he anticipated. Danny tried to stay away from the studio, but every time he sat down in his apartment, his mind raced with thoughts of his next project, the next gallery show, and the next piece he had to finish. It was like he couldn't turn off the mental noise. He'd get up, pace around, and then sit back down, convinced he needed to work, convinced he couldn't afford to slow down. But on the third day, something shifted. He went for a long walk in the park, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. The trees were beginning to shed their leaves, creating a patchwork of colors on the ground. There was something calming about the simple rhythm of walking. Each step was a small, mindful movement. He felt the weight of his thoughts begin to lift, as if the walk itself was pulling him out of the mental fog he'd been trapped in. After an hour, he found a quiet bench by a pond and sat down, watching the ripples in the water. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to simply be. No expectations, no pressure, no deadlines. Just the present moment. It was a small act, but it felt liberating. Danny pulled out his sketchbook and started drawing. It wasn't for a gallery or for any particular show. It was just for him. The sketches flowed easily, uninhibited by the usual demands of his art. He drew the shapes of the trees around him, the birds that flew overhead, the way the water rippled with each breeze. It was a reminder of why he had turned to art in the first place. To capture the world around him, to express his inner landscape, to create something that felt real. Over the next few weeks, Danny spent more time outside the studio. He took walks in the park, visited local museums, and reconnected with old friends. He allowed himself to experience life without constantly worrying about the next big project or the expectations of others. And through it all, he realized something important. The world didn't hinge on his next success. Life wasn't about the awards or the recognition. It was about the moments in between, the quiet experiences that shaped who he was. One afternoon, he met up with Sarah again for coffee. She had noticed the change in him, the way he seemed lighter, more at ease. "You look different, Danny," Sarah said, smiling as she sipped her coffee. "What's going on?" Danny smiled back, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I think I'm finally learning how to breathe again. I've been so focused on my art, my career, that I forgot to just live. I've been taking some time off, not working so much, just being present." Sarah's eyes softened. "That sounds good. You've earned it." "I don't think I realized how much I needed it," Danny said, his voice thoughtful. "I've always been so scared of slowing down, of losing everything. But now, I feel like I'm rediscovering myself." Sarah reached across the table and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "I'm proud of you, Danny. You've come so far." Danny looked at her, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't expected. "I couldn't have done it without people like you in my life." As the weeks turned into months, Danny found himself gradually returning to his art, but with a renewed sense of purpose. His work felt different now, not just a reflection of his past struggles, but an expression of his present self. He wasn't chasing recognition anymore. He was creating for the sake of creating, allowing himself the freedom to experiment and grow without the fear of failure hanging over him. He also started thinking about his next steps in a different way. The pressure to constantly achieve was gone, replaced by a desire to build something sustainable, something that would bring him fulfillment in the long term. It wasn't about the hustle anymore. It was about balance. He started planning his next exhibition, but this time, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about telling his story, showing the world who he had become. Clara, too, noticed the change in him. She was still his biggest advocate, but she could see that he was now more grounded, more aware of what he needed. "You're on a new path, Danny," she said one afternoon while they were discussing his upcoming show. "And I think it's the right one. You're not just trying to prove something anymore. You're living your truth." Danny smiled. "It's funny, Clara. For so long, I thought success was about what everyone else saw. But now, I realize it's about how I feel inside. And for the first time, I feel at peace." Danny had always known that his art was a mirror of his soul. Every brushstroke, every color, every shape. It was all an extension of who he was. But for a long time, that mirror had been cracked, distorted by the pressures of success and the fear of losing everything he had worked so hard for. Now, as he sat before his blank canvas in the quiet of his studio, he felt something different, a sense of clarity. It was as if the noise in his head had quieted, and he could finally hear the quiet hum of his own voice, the true voice that had always been there, waiting for him to listen. For weeks now, Danny had been rediscovering the joy of creating without the burden of expectations. He had been allowing himself to explore new techniques, to experiment with colors and styles that he hadn't dared to try before. The freedom was exhilarating, but it also felt like he was rediscovering a part of himself that had been buried for far too long. The canvas before him seemed to pulse with possibilities. He had learned to trust the process, to let go of the need for immediate results. This time, he wasn't concerned with whether or not the piece would sell or whether it would make a statement in the art world. This time, he was creating for himself. Danny picked up his brush, dipped it in a vibrant shade of blue, and let it glide across the surface. He wasn't sure what the final product would look like, but he didn't need to know. He let the brush flow, following the rhythm of his thoughts, his emotions. There was no right or wrong, no good or bad. There was just the act of creation. As the first layer of paint began to take shape, Danny felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't just making art. He was reconnecting with a part of himself that he had almost forgotten existed, the part of him that had once painted for pure joy, without any thought of validation or success. He was finding his way back to the root of his passion. A few days later, Clara stopped by the studio to check on Danny's progress. She had been worried about him when he first started taking time off, but now, seeing him in the studio with a renewed sense of purpose, she felt a wave of relief. He was back to his true self, the artist who had once created for the love of it, not for the accolades or the recognition. "Hey, you," Clara said with a smile as she walked into the studio. "How's it going?" Danny looked up from his canvas, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "It's going good. Better than good, actually. I think I'm finally remembering what it feels like to just create." Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's a pretty big statement, Danny. You were always creating, right?" He chuckled. "Yeah, but I was also constantly chasing something. I was too focused on the future, on what I had to do next, that I forgot why I started doing this in the first place." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "I get it. You were trying to prove something, but you don't need to anymore. You've already done it." Danny paused, considering her words. She was right. In many ways, he had already proved to himself and to the world that he was capable of greatness. But now, he was beginning to realize that greatness wasn't measured by the number of shows or awards. It was measured by the depth of the work and the authenticity behind it. "I think I'm finally ready to show the world who I really am," Danny said quietly. "Not the artist they expect me to be, but the one I am right now. The one who's learning how to be at peace with himself." Clara smiled warmly. "I'm really proud of you, Danny. You've come so far." The weeks continued to pass, and Danny's work began to take on a new life. He had abandoned the pressure to create art that fit into a specific mold, and instead, he let the canvas speak to him. The pieces were bold and raw, infused with emotions he had once kept buried deep inside. There were moments of darkness, sure, but there were also bursts of light, colors, and shapes that reflected the balance he had found within himself. As the time for his next exhibition approached, Danny felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He hadn't planned for this show to be a big statement, but as the pieces began to come together, he realized that it was. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about telling his story, his truth, through his art. One night, as he stood in front of the last piece he had completed for the show, he took a deep breath. The painting was an abstract representation of the journey he had been on, an intricate web of colors, swirls, and textures that spoke to the complexity of his emotions. There were moments of chaos, where the colors clashed and overlapped, and moments of calm, where the strokes were deliberate and peaceful. It was a reflection of his life, messy, uncertain, but beautiful in its imperfection. Danny felt a sense of pride in the work, but more than that, he felt a sense of peace. He had created something that was true to who he was, and that was all that mattered. The night of the exhibition arrived, and Danny stood in front of the gallery, looking up at the building that had become a symbol of his success. It was the same gallery where he had showcased his first solo show, the one that had launched his career. But tonight, it felt different. This show wasn't about his past or his struggles. It was about the man he was today, the artist who had found his way back to himself. As guests filtered into the gallery, Danny felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. He was used to the attention, but this time, it felt more personal. This wasn't just a collection of paintings, it was a collection of his soul. People milled around, taking in the pieces, commenting on the bold use of color and texture. Danny overheard a few conversations about how his work had evolved, how much more depth there was to it now. He smiled to himself, knowing that the change they saw was a reflection of the change he had gone through. At one point, Clara pulled him aside. Her face lit up with pride. "You did it, Danny," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is your truth. It's beautiful." Danny looked around at the gallery, at the people who had come to see his work, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had achieved something more valuable than any accolade. He had rediscovered who he was, and he had shared that journey with the world through his art. And as the night went on, with people admiring his work and asking questions, Danny realized that the true measure of his success wasn't in the number of paintings sold or the praise he received. It was in the freedom he felt to be himself, unapologetically and fully. The days after the exhibition passed in a blur of new opportunities and reflective moments. Danny had been feeling lighter, more at peace with where his life was headed, but there was something else, something unspoken that still lingered at the back of his mind. It was the thought that he had only scratched the surface of what he could achieve, but this time, his goals weren't driven by the need for recognition or success. They were fueled by a genuine desire to grow and to challenge himself. He was no longer trying to outrun his past. Instead, he was embracing it and learning from it. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when he decided to take a walk through the city's downtown. The streets were quieter than usual, a rare sight for the bustling part of town. Danny loved moments like this, where the city felt still, almost meditative. He'd learned to appreciate these small pauses, the ones that offered a break from the noise of everyday life. As he walked, he noticed how the reflections in the puddles made the city look surreal, like another world entirely. He felt oddly connected to the rain-slicked sidewalks, as though the world was momentarily slowing down just for him. As he passed by a small cafe, he noticed a man sitting outside under the awning. The man's clothes were worn, his hair unkempt, but it wasn't just his appearance that caught Danny's attention. It was the way he looked, almost as if he was waiting for something. He was staring straight ahead, but there was a sense of purpose in his gaze, a quiet intensity. Danny stopped in his tracks, curiosity tugging at him. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to approach the man, but something about him seemed familiar, as if their paths were meant to cross at this very moment. He walked up to the man slowly, his footsteps softened by the rain. The man didn't notice him at first, but when Danny was close enough, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Hey," Danny said, unsure of what to expect. "You okay?" The man's head snapped toward him, and for a moment, Danny felt a flicker of hesitation. But then the man smiled, a faint, almost grateful smile. "I'm fine," the man replied, his voice raspy but warm. "Just taking a break." Danny paused, trying to decide whether or not to continue the conversation. There was something about the man that made him want to linger. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the quiet calm that seemed to radiate from him despite his apparent hardships. But as he looked more closely, Danny saw that the man wasn't just passing through. He had an air of someone who had been here for a while, someone who had seen both the best and the worst of life. "My name's Danny," Danny said, extending his hand. The man looked at it for a moment before shaking it firmly. "Joe," the man replied. "You don't need to worry about me, though. I'm just another face in the crowd." Danny didn't know why, but those words stuck with him. Just another face in the crowd. It was as if the man had resigned himself to a life of invisibility, one where he didn't expect anything to change. But there was something in his eyes that told a different story. Danny knew what it felt like to be stuck in a place you didn't want to be, to feel like the world was moving on without you. "So, what's your story?" Danny asked after a moment, his curiosity getting the better of him. Joe looked at him, surprised by the question. He seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether he wanted to share anything, but after a long pause, he spoke. "I've been on the streets for a while now. Lost my job, lost my family, lost everything I thought I had. But I've kept going. I don't know why. I guess there's still some part of me that believes there's more to life than just surviving. Danny listened closely, realizing that Joe's words struck a chord deep within him. He had been so focused on his own struggles and his own journey that he hadn't stopped to think about the many people who were just trying to get by, each one carrying their own burdens. I can relate, Danny said softly. Sometimes it feels like you're stuck in one place, and no matter what you do, nothing ever changes. Joe nodded, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly. Exactly. But every day, you wake up and keep going. You don't know why, but you do. Maybe that's the key to surviving. To keep going, even when it feels like you're invisible. There was a heavy silence between them as the rain continued to fall around them. Danny thought about his own journey, how he had been running for so long, constantly trying to prove himself to the world. But in his pursuit of success, he had forgotten what it felt like to truly stop and just be. I don't think you're invisible, Danny said quietly. Not to me. Joe looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he offered a small smile. Thanks, but I think the world's got a funny way of making you feel like you don't matter, even when you do. Danny stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He wanted to offer Joe something, anything, that might make him feel seen, heard. But all he had was his time, and that seemed like enough. I'm Danny, he said again, extending his hand. And if you ever need anything, even just someone to talk to, I'm here. Joe looked at his hand for a moment, and then, with a hesitant but genuine look, he shook it. Thanks, Joe said softly. You're a good guy, Danny. But sometimes, the world's a little too big for people like me. Danny didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded. He knew the feeling of being small in a world that often seemed indifferent. But he also knew something else, that no one, no matter how broken or lost they felt, was truly invisible. Not if someone was willing to see them. That evening, as Danny walked back to his apartment, his mind kept returning to the conversation he'd had with Joe. There was something about that moment that felt significant, like it had shifted something inside him. He had been so focused on his own journey, his own growth, that he had failed to see the struggles of those around him. But Joe had reminded him that everyone was fighting a battle, even if it wasn't always visible on the surface. Danny couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance at his own life, a chance to rebuild and rediscover his purpose. But Joe was still fighting, still pushing through each day, even when it felt like the world had forgotten him. For the first time in a long while, Danny realized that his path wasn't just about personal success or artistic achievement. It was about making a difference, about seeing others, truly seeing them, and offering what he could to help them find their way. After his encounter with Joe, Danny couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. The world's a little too big for people like me. They echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. Danny had always been focused on his art, on his career, on his own journey of self-discovery, but now he realized that the bigger picture was much broader than his own world. He had always been driven by his own struggles, but now he saw how interconnected everyone's stories truly were. The rain had finally stopped the next morning, leaving behind a cool, crisp air. Danny sat by his window, sipping his coffee, reflecting on everything that had changed in his life. He thought about the exhibition, about how far he'd come, and about how much he still had to give. But it wasn't just about his art anymore. He could no longer ignore the reality that there were people, like Joe, who were living lives of quiet desperation, invisible to most. People who didn't have the luxury of art or recognition, but who still mattered deeply. And that's when it hit him. Danny stood up abruptly, a spark of excitement igniting in his chest. He wasn't sure where this new idea would lead him, but he knew he had to try. He had been given so much. Success, opportunity, a second chance at peace, and it was time to do something more with it. He would create art, yes, but this time, he would use it for something bigger than himself. He grabbed his phone and quickly dialed Clara. He knew she would understand, even if she didn't quite grasp the full weight of his plan just yet. Hey, Clara, it's me. I've been thinking a lot, Danny said when she picked up. Oh, Clara responded teasingly. What have you been thinking about now? Danny laughed. shaking his head as he paced back and forth in his apartment. Something big. Something different. I want to do more with my art. I want to use it to help people, specifically those who are invisible, the ones living on the streets, the ones who feel like they don't matter. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Clara responded with a gentle, "I'm listening." "I don't know what it's going to look like yet," Danny continued, "but I want to start a project, maybe even a series of artworks, that reflects the stories of people like Joe, the ones whose voices aren't heard, whose lives are ignored. I want to make them visible. I want to create pieces that show their humanity, that show their value, and then use the proceeds to help them." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing the idea. Danny knew this wasn't going to be an easy or conventional project. It was risky, in some ways, because it could be misunderstood. But he also knew it was the right thing to do. "I think that's an incredible idea, Danny," Clara finally said, her voice filled with warmth. "Art has the power to change the world. And if anyone can make people see the world differently, it's you." Danny smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. Clara's support had always meant the world to him, and knowing she was behind him gave him the confidence he needed to move forward. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Danny spent his days painting, working on pieces that would capture the raw emotions of the people he had met, the ones who had felt forgotten. He didn't want to sugarcoat their lives. He didn't want to create idealized portraits. Instead, he focused on capturing their struggles, their resilience, and the complexity of their experiences. He wanted to tell their stories in a way that felt authentic, raw, and unfiltered. It wasn't easy. Danny had to confront a lot of uncomfortable truths about the world, about the ways in which society often overlooks those in need. But with each stroke of the brush, he felt a deeper sense of purpose. This wasn't just about art for art's sake anymore. It was about starting a conversation, about challenging the status quo, and about using his platform to do something meaningful. As he worked, he spent more time with Joe, learning more about his life. They met at the same cafe where they'd first spoken, and Danny took the time to listen to Joe's story, to understand the things that had shaped him. Joe wasn't just a homeless man. He was a person with a past, with dreams, with memories of a life before the streets. He had once been a teacher, a father, and a husband. But life had unfolded in ways he never could have imagined, and now he was just trying to find a way to survive. Danny's conversations with Joe became an essential part of the project. He would ask questions, listen to Joe's reflections, and use those conversations as inspiration for the pieces he was creating. Joe wasn't just a subject for Danny's art. He was an integral part of the process, helping to shape the narrative that Danny wanted to tell. But Danny wasn't just focusing on Joe. He began to reach out to other people on the streets, connecting with them and hearing their stories. He met people who had fallen on hard times, who had lost their families, their homes, their sense of identity. He met people who had been through unimaginable trauma and pain, but were still finding the strength to keep going. It was humbling. It was heartbreaking. And it was life-changing. Danny was determined to make these people's stories heard, not just through his art, but through a campaign that would raise awareness about homelessness. He began working with local organizations to find ways to donate the proceeds from his art sales directly to shelters, to support those who needed it the most. He wanted to create a tangible impact, not just by selling his paintings, but by using them as a vehicle for change. A month later, Danny stood in front of the finished pieces, his heart swelling with pride. The exhibition had taken on a completely new life. It was no longer just an art show. It was a call to action. Each piece was accompanied by a short narrative, a piece of the person's story that Danny had captured through their words, their experiences. The opening night was filled with a buzz of excitement and anticipation. The gallery had agreed to host the show, and Danny had worked with local businesses to spread the word. He was nervous, but he was also excited to see the impact it would have. The purpose behind this exhibition felt bigger than anything he had ever done before. It wasn't just about showcasing his talent. It was about changing the way people viewed homelessness and those who lived on the margins. As the doors opened and guests filed into the gallery, Danny couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He had expected the room to be filled with familiar faces, art enthusiasts, and critics. But what he hadn't expected was the number of people who had been directly impacted by the cause, the people whose stories he had captured on his canvases. Joe was there, standing near the entrance, his eyes filled with tears as he took in the sight of the exhibition. Danny walked over to him, feeling a lump form in his throat. Joe's presence here was a testament to everything this project stood for. "I never thought I'd see the day," Joe said softly, his voice trembling. "I never thought anyone would care enough to see me for who I am." Danny placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "You're not invisible anymore, Joe. You've always mattered." The opening night of Danny's exhibition left him feeling both exhilarated and deeply humbled. The gallery was filled with people who marveled at the art, but more than the admiration for his talent, there was something bigger happening. Conversations sparked between the attendees, not just about the paintings, but about the stories behind them. Stories of people who were so often ignored by society. Danny had never felt such a powerful connection between his work and the world around him. It was as if each brushstroke, each portrait he'd painted, had become a bridge between two worlds, the world of the privileged and the world of the forgotten. As guests walked from painting to painting, they were not just seeing faces. They were seeing lives, struggles, and resilience. Joe stood quietly by one of the larger canvases, the one that depicted him in a moment of solitude, the weight of his past reflected in the lines of his face. Danny approached him, unsure of what to say. He knew how much this moment meant to Joe, and he didn't want to say the wrong thing. But before he could speak, Joe turned to him, his eyes wet with tears. "I never thought anyone would see me," he whispered. "I never thought anyone would care." Danny's heart tightened. "Joe, you've always mattered," he said gently. "You just had to be seen." Joe's smile was small but powerful, and in that moment, Danny realized that this exhibition wasn't just a show. It was a movement. The people who had been part of it, the ones who had shared their stories with him, who had trusted him enough to allow their pain to become his art, had unknowingly started something bigger than any one person could have imagined. The days following the exhibition were a whirlwind. Danny's phone rang nonstop with media outlets requesting interviews and articles about the show. But it wasn't the publicity that had him energized. It was the feedback he was receiving from the people who had attended, people who had never thought twice about homelessness before, but who now wanted to know how they could help, how they could make a difference. He was receiving messages from artists and activists, each one expressing how moved they were by the project and offering support. Some offered to collaborate on future campaigns, while others asked how they could directly contribute to the cause. The ripple effect of the exhibition had begun, and it was spreading far beyond what Danny had imagined. One evening, Clara came by to visit Danny, bringing with her a stack of letters that had arrived at the gallery. Danny had already been getting letters from individuals who wanted to help, but this stack was different. It was from organizations, local shelters, food banks, and mental health services, all offering partnerships, funding, and resources to support the homeless. "I think we're on to something big here, Danny," Clara said as she placed the letters on his kitchen table. "This isn't just a one-time thing. People are talking, and they want to help." Danny sat down, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just about creating art anymore. It was about using his platform to change perceptions, to build a movement, and to give people the tools they needed to make real, lasting change. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was a voice for the voiceless, a connector between those who had resources and those who needed them most. But even with all the excitement, there were still challenges ahead. The road to change wasn't easy, and Danny knew that there would be resistance. Some people would dismiss the project as just another art show. Others would argue that the issues of homelessness were too complex to solve with a few paintings. But Danny was ready for the fight. He wasn't doing this for recognition or for praise. He was doing it because he believed in the cause, and because he'd seen firsthand how powerful a simple act of seeing someone could be. Weeks passed, and Danny found himself working more closely with the organizations that had reached out. He met with local leaders, activists, and social workers who were already on the front lines, trying to make a difference in the lives of the homeless population. He learned about the systemic issues that contributed to homelessness, from the lack of affordable housing to the challenges of mental health and addiction. The more he learned, the more he realized that the issues were vast, and the solutions were not simple. But that didn't mean they were impossible. Every small change mattered. Every story shared mattered. Every act of kindness mattered. And Danny knew that he had to keep pushing, keep working toward a future where people like Joe wouldn't have to feel invisible anymore. It was during one of these meetings with a local outreach organization that Danny had an idea, a way to take the exhibition to the next level. "I think we need to take the art out of the gallery," Danny said, his voice full of excitement. "What if we took some of these paintings to the places where the homeless live, to the shelters and the streets, and hung them there? What if we brought the art directly to the people who need to feel seen the most?" The group looked at him with interest, and Clara, who had been by his side throughout the process, nodded in agreement. "That's a brilliant idea," she said. "It's one thing for people to come to the gallery, but it's another thing entirely to bring the art to the people it's meant for." Danny felt a sense of urgency. This project couldn't be confined to just one gallery showing. The art needed to be where the people were, where the stories were. It needed to be a part of the conversation in real time, in the places where it could make a true impact. The next few months were filled with planning, fundraising, and logistics. Danny worked tirelessly, gathering the resources to take the exhibition to the streets and shelters. He partnered with local businesses and donors to fund the project, and he enlisted the help of volunteers who would help install the artwork in various locations around the city. The first off-the-wall exhibition took place in a downtown shelter, where the walls were lined with the faces of the homeless, each one a story waiting to be told. The reactions from the people there were overwhelming. Some wept as they saw their own reflections in the paintings. Others smiled, shaking their heads in disbelief at the idea that anyone would care enough to depict their lives with such care and dignity. As the exhibition toured different locations, it sparked conversations everywhere it went. People began to ask questions, to look at homelessness through a different lens. Danny wasn't just creating art. He was creating change, one painting at a time. Danny stood in the midst of the latest exhibition installation, looking around at the faces of the people who had gathered. He couldn't help but smile. The gallery, though unconventional in setting, was filled with energy. The walls of the downtown shelter were now adorned with his paintings, each one telling a story of a life that had once been hidden. The vibrant colors on the canvas contrasted with the dull, gray walls of the shelter, transforming the space in a way that Danny had never imagined. The reactions were profound. Some guests, including local journalists, were visibly moved as they walked from one piece to the next. The residents, too, had begun to gather around the artwork, talking amongst themselves, nodding in recognition, and pointing out familiar faces. It was a moment of validation for everyone involved. As he moved through the crowd, Danny's phone buzzed. He stepped aside to answer. "Danny?" Clara's voice came through the line, a mix of excitement and urgency in her tone. "We just got an invitation." Danny raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Invitation to what?" "To meet with a panel of city leaders," she replied, her voice steady but excited. "They want to hear more about the exhibition, about your project. They're impressed with the impact it's had so far, and they want to discuss how they can support it." Danny's heart skipped a beat. City leaders? This was bigger than anything he'd imagined when he first picked up his paintbrush. "Wait, are you serious?" "I'm serious," Clara confirmed. "They see the potential in this, Danny. They're ready to take it to the next level." A mixture of excitement and nervousness washed over him. He hadn't planned for this. He'd been so focused on the art, the stories, and the people involved that he hadn't really thought about how the project would evolve. But this was an opportunity to do something that could affect real change, something that could provide tangible support for the people he had been working so hard to raise awareness about. "I'll make arrangements," Clara continued. "We need to prepare." Danny took a deep breath. "Okay, let's do this." The meeting with the city leaders took place 2 weeks later. It was a formal setting, one that made Danny feel like a fish out of water. He was accustomed to gallery openings, to creating art and presenting it to the public. But sitting across from government officials, social service providers, and policymakers was a different kind of challenge. He wasn't just presenting a body of work now. He was advocating for a cause that was much larger than himself. He wasn't just an artist anymore. He was an advocate. The room was full of well-dressed individuals, all with sharp suits and serious expressions. But Danny noticed that they weren't dismissing him. In fact, there was a genuine interest in their eyes. They listened as he explained the concept behind the exhibition and shared the feedback he had received from the shelters and the people who had viewed the paintings. "This exhibition has been more than just art," Danny said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's been a way for people to see the homeless as individuals, to see them as more than just a statistic or a problem. These are people with stories, with struggles, with dreams. And when we see them, we start to realize that we can make a difference." One of the panel members, a woman in her early 50s who Danny recognized as a local councilwoman, spoke up. "You've created something truly remarkable here, Danny. But you're right. This is just the beginning. We have to address the root causes of homelessness if we want to make a lasting impact. We need more than just awareness. We need solutions." Danny nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Exactly. This isn't just about shining a light on homelessness. It's about changing the systems that allow it to persist. I've been talking with shelters, mental health services, and local outreach programs. There's a need for affordable housing, job training, and better access to mental health care. But what we also need is a shift in how we, as a society, view homelessness." There was a quiet murmur of agreement around the table, and Danny felt a spark of hope. This wasn't just about painting anymore. This was about creating a movement, a systemic change that could affect real lives. "We're listening," said another man at the table, a middle-aged man with glasses who Danny knew was a local philanthropist. "Tell us what you need, Danny. How can we help?" Danny took a deep breath. "I want to take this project further. I want to continue bringing art to the people who need it most. But more than that, I want to create a partnership with the city to help fund initiatives that directly address homelessness. I want to build a coalition of artists, activists, and local leaders who can work together to provide not just temporary relief, but long-term solutions." The councilwoman smiled, clearly impressed by the clarity of his vision. "That's ambitious, but it's exactly what we need. We have the resources, Danny. We have the infrastructure. What we need is the vision, and you've given us that." Danny felt a wave of gratitude. He had come into this room unsure of what to expect, but now, he saw that the seeds he had planted were beginning to bear fruit. This wasn't just about art anymore. It was about creating a space where the homeless could find a seat at the table, where they could have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. By the end of the meeting, the panel had offered their full support. They pledged funding for the next phase of Danny's project, which would include expanding the exhibition, providing grants for mental health services, and developing programs to assist with job placement and housing. The city's involvement would allow Danny to reach even more people, to amplify the impact of the exhibition, and to work alongside social workers and advocates to make a lasting difference. As Danny left the meeting, he felt both overwhelmed and empowered. It was one thing to create art and tell stories. It was another to work with people in positions of power to bring about change. But Danny knew this was the only way forward. If he wanted to make the impact he dreamed of, he would have to keep pushing, keep fighting for the people whose voices were often drowned out by society's indifference. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Danny worked with local government officials, nonprofits, and other artists to design the next phase of the project. They planned pop-up exhibitions, street installations, and a community outreach program that would give homeless individuals the opportunity to share their stories and participate in the creation of new artwork. Danny knew this wasn't going to be easy. It would require collaboration, patience, and a lot of hard work. But he was determined to see it through. One morning, as Danny prepared to head out for another meeting, he received a message from Joe. It simply read, "I want to help." "We're listening," said another man at the table, a middle-aged man with glasses who Danny knew was a local philanthropist. "Tell us what you need, Danny. How can we help?" Danny took a deep breath. "I want to take this project further. I want to continue bringing art to the people who need it most. But more than that, I want to create a partnership with the city to help fund initiatives that directly address homelessness. I want to build a coalition of artists, activists, and local leaders who can work together to provide not just temporary relief, but long-term solutions." The councilwoman smiled, clearly impressed by the clarity of his vision. "That's ambitious, but it's exactly what we need. We have the resources, Danny. We have the infrastructure. What we need is the vision, and you've given us that." Danny felt a wave of gratitude. He had come into this room unsure of what to expect, but now he saw that the seeds he had planted were beginning to bear fruit. This wasn't just about art anymore. It was about creating a space where the homeless could find a seat at the table, where they could have a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. By the end of the meeting, the panel had offered their full support. They pledged funding for the next phase of Danny's project, which would include expanding the exhibition, providing grants for mental health services, and developing programs to assist with job placement and housing. The city's involvement would allow Danny to reach even more people, to amplify the impact of the exhibition, and to work alongside social workers and advocates to make a lasting difference. As Danny left the meeting, he felt both overwhelmed and empowered. It was one thing to create art and tell stories. It was another to work with people in positions of power to bring about change. But Danny knew this was the only way forward. If he wanted to make the impact he dreamed of, he would have to keep pushing, keep fighting for the people whose voices were often drowned out by society's indifference. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Danny worked with local government officials, nonprofits, and other artists to design the next phase of the project. They planned pop-up exhibitions, street installations, and a community outreach program that would give homeless individuals the opportunity to share their stories and participate in the creation of new artwork. Danny knew this wasn't going to be easy. It would require collaboration, patience, and a lot of hard work. But he was determined to see it through. One morning, as Danny prepared to head out for another meeting, he received a message from Joe. It simply read, "I want to help." Danny's heart swelled. Joe's willingness to be involved was a testament to how far they had come. What had started as a conversation between two strangers had grown into something much bigger. Together, they were starting to build a new narrative, one where homelessness wasn't a condition to be ignored, but a story to be told, understood, and acted upon. The whirlwind of city meetings, exhibitions, and collaborations was only growing, but amidst all the chaos, Danny found himself more grounded than ever. As his vision continued to expand, he realized that the most important aspect of this project wasn't the paintings or even the gallery tours. It was the community that was forming around the cause. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about creating a network of support that could carry the work forward long after the last brushstroke had dried. Clara had been his steadfast partner throughout it all, but now, with the support of the city and local organizations, Danny felt a sense of responsibility that was both invigorating and daunting. As he looked at the upcoming plans for the project, the excitement was palpable. But alongside the thrill, there was a deep awareness of how important it was to get this right. One of the first initiatives was to host a series of workshops at the shelters where Danny had previously installed the art. The idea was to give homeless individuals an opportunity to create their own pieces, to tell their stories through art, and to have those works displayed in the same space that had first shown Danny's paintings. He wanted them to experience the same sense of validation that he had hoped to provide for them when they first saw their portraits on the gallery walls. Danny had worked with several local artists to lead the workshops. These were people who understood the power of creative expression and who could facilitate an environment where people felt safe to share their experiences. The first session was held at a local shelter that had recently partnered with the project. As Danny stepped inside, he was greeted by the sight of familiar faces: Joe, Linda, and several others he had met during the exhibition. They were waiting in the common room, eager and excited to start. "Hey, Danny," Joe called out, waving him over. "I'm ready to paint my story, man." Danny smiled, a sense of warmth filling him as he made his way over. "I'm excited to see what you create, Joe. This is your space today." As the workshop began, Danny watched as the room filled with the energy of people who had long been overlooked, but now had a platform to speak. Some of the participants worked quietly, while others shared their stories aloud, discussing the emotions they wanted to capture in their art. Danny moved between the tables, offering encouragement and guidance, but ultimately, it was about letting the participants find their own voice. "What are you painting, Linda?" Danny asked one woman, who had been focused intently on a canvas. Linda looked up, her eyes bright but tinged with sadness. "I'm painting a house. A real one. Not the kind I've been living in for the last few years, but the one I dream of, where I'm not scared to sleep at night, where I can be at peace." Danny nodded, touched by her vulnerability. That's beautiful. You're telling your story. And it was in that moment, watching Linda pour her heart into her art, that Danny realized just how powerful this initiative was. It wasn't just about creating awareness. It was about giving people the tools and the space to reclaim their narratives. Over the next few months, the workshops continued to grow. Danny, Clara, and the team of artists traveled to multiple shelters, each one a new experience, a new opportunity to connect with people who had been living in the shadows for too long. But now, they were stepping into the light, holding their brushes with pride and telling their truths through paint, sculpture, photography, and mixed media. The artwork that emerged from these sessions was raw and beautiful, each piece a testament to the resilience, pain, hope, and dreams of those who had created it. But more than the art itself, it was the transformation in the participants that struck Danny the hardest. He saw people who had once felt invisible standing taller, speaking louder, and engaging more deeply with the world around them. At the same time, the project was gaining momentum beyond the local shelters. Media outlets picked up on the story, and soon, Danny was invited to speak at national conferences and forums about homelessness and art's role in social change. But no matter how much attention the project garnered, Danny never lost sight of what mattered most: the people whose stories were at the heart of it all. One day, during a panel discussion on homelessness, Danny found himself standing before an audience of policymakers, philanthropists, and social workers. The topic was shifting the conversation about homelessness from charity to empowerment, and as Danny spoke, he could feel the weight of the room's attention on him. His words came from a place of passion, born from months of work on the ground, but they also came from his own experiences with Joe, Linda, and the others who had shared their lives with him. The problem with homelessness isn't just that people don't have homes, Danny explained. It's that they don't have a voice. They're seen as a problem, as a statistic, as a burden. But when we give people the opportunity to speak, when we give them the chance to be heard and seen, something changes. They start to believe that they matter. And that belief, that spark of self-worth, is the foundation for everything else. The room was silent for a moment, and then the applause came. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the nods of understanding and the expressions of agreement that followed. The conversation was shifting. People were starting to see homelessness not as a societal failure, but as a failure of empathy. They were beginning to understand that the solution wasn't just about providing shelter, but about giving people the agency to shape their own futures. As the project grew, so did the sense of community around it. Artists, social workers, volunteers, and advocates all came together under one shared goal: to create a more compassionate and just world for those experiencing homelessness. Local businesses offered their spaces for exhibitions, while schools and universities partnered with the initiative to provide resources and awareness. Danny's art had become a catalyst for a broader movement, a movement that was shifting the narrative around homelessness in ways that were tangible and real. Through it all, Danny remained focused on the heart of the project, the people. He continued to visit the shelters, checking in with old friends like Joe and Linda, and hearing their stories as they painted their dreams. He could see the transformation in their faces. They weren't just the subjects of his art anymore. They were partners in the movement, driving the change that had begun. One afternoon, as Danny was walking through one of the shelters, Joe approached him with a look of quiet determination. "Danny, I've been thinking," Joe began, his voice steady. "I've got a place to stay now. It's not perfect, but it's mine. And I'm ready to help other people get to that point too. I want to give back." Danny stopped in his tracks, surprised by the depth of Joe's words. "Joe, that's amazing. You've come so far." Joe smiled. "I've come a long way, yeah. But now it's time to help others do the same." And in that moment, Danny realized that the ripple effect wasn't just about the art anymore. It was about the people who had been touched by it. People like Joe, who had been given the space to grow, to dream, and to ultimately transform their own lives. The power of community wasn't just about the collective support. It was about individuals reaching back to help those who were still struggling. The energy was electric. Danny could feel it in his bones, the sense that something bigger was unfolding. What started as an exhibition had transformed into a full-fledged movement, a tide of change that was sweeping through the city. More people were joining the cause: artists, Social workers, even business owners who had once been indifferent were now offering their support. People were beginning to see the power of community in a way they never had before. One of the most important developments was the partnership Danny and Clara had formed with local mental health professionals. The realization had dawned on both of them that homelessness wasn't just a housing problem. It was deeply intertwined with issues of mental health, addiction, and trauma. And while Danny's artwork had created a bridge for people to express themselves, the healing could not end there. It was crucial to address the mental health needs of the homeless population in order for any long-term change to occur. That's when Clara had suggested reaching out to Dr. Thomas Hayes, a well-known therapist who had been working with underserved communities for over 20 years. After a few meetings, Dr. Hayes was fully on board, offering not only his expertise but also connecting Danny with a network of mental health professionals who could assist in the workshops. "I think we've cracked something here, Danny," Clara said one evening as they sat in Danny's small office, surrounded by art supplies and paperwork. "The art is powerful, but the mental health component? That's the piece that's been missing. We need a holistic approach to healing." Danny nodded. "I agree. People can't move forward without healing what's inside first. Art has been a way to unlock those emotions, but therapy is what will help them process it. Together, this can be the start of something truly life-changing." The first joint therapy art session took place at a small community center, a space that had been donated by a local nonprofit. Danny had seen the way people had responded to the art in the shelters, but this was different. This wasn't just about painting a picture or sculpting a form. It was about digging deep into the emotional pain and using art as a tool for healing. The room was set up with canvases, art supplies, and a few cozy chairs in the center where participants could gather and share their thoughts. Dr. Hayes opened the session by leading a group meditation to help everyone relax and center themselves. Danny, Clara, and a few volunteer artists worked alongside the participants, guiding them through the creation process while Dr. Hayes facilitated individual conversations in the corners of the room. It was a slow start. Some participants sat quietly at first, unsure about opening up or creating art. Others picked up their brushes tentatively, unsure how to translate their pain into color. But as the hours passed, a transformation began to take place. The silence in the room shifted, replaced by gentle conversation and quiet sobs. For some, the art was a way to express feelings they hadn't been able to vocalize before. For others, it was a way to reclaim ownership over a part of their lives that had been taken from them. "I've never told anyone this," said a woman named Jessica, her voice trembling as she looked at the canvas she had been working on. "But this picture, it's about the night I lost my daughter. I still don't know how to live with that. It's like I'm stuck." Danny walked over to her, his heart heavy. He could see the rawness in her eyes. "You don't have to figure it all out right now, Jessica. Art is a way of processing, of moving through the pain. You don't need to have all the answers." Jessica wiped her eyes, offering a small smile. "Thank you, Danny. I think this is the first time in years I felt like I could breathe again." As the program continued, the ripple effect of their work became even more apparent. Stories began to emerge from participants who had felt like their voices didn't matter. People like Jessica, who had carried unbearable burdens, were now starting to find ways to share their pain and their strength through the creative process. The workshops were no longer just about painting pictures. They were about reclaiming lives. One evening, as Danny walked through the community center, Clara approached him with a file folder in hand. She was beaming. "You're not going to believe this," she said, flipping through the folder. "The city just approved funding for a new initiative, one that's going to take this program to every shelter in the city. They want to expand the mental health art therapy to all the shelters, and they've allocated a budget for training more therapists and artists to work with these individuals." Danny's heart raced. This was everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of. He had always known that the art had the power to heal, but now the city was recognizing it. This wasn't just a small project anymore. It was becoming a movement with real, tangible resources behind it. "This is incredible, Clara," Danny said, still in awe. "We're actually going to do this. We're going to reach so many more people." Clara smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "There's more. They want you to be the face of the initiative, speak at the press conferences, lead the training programs. They believe in you, Danny. Danny wasn't sure how to respond. He'd been in the trenches with the people at the shelters, working side by side with them, but now he was being thrust into a position of leadership and visibility. The thought of being in the spotlight made him uneasy. He wasn't an expert in policy or public speaking. He was just an artist who wanted to make a difference. I don't know if I'm the right person for that, Danny said hesitantly. I'm just doing what I can, but leading an initiative like this? It feels like a lot. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. You've already been leading this, Danny. Your heart is in it. People believe in what you're doing. You're not alone in this. We're all in this together. The press conference was set for the following week. Danny had spent days preparing, rehearsing his speech, and meeting with the media team. The anticipation in the air was palpable. This was the moment when everything they had worked for would be showcased to the world. When the day arrived, Danny stood backstage, his palms sweaty and his mind racing. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the kind of attention that was about to come. He had never imagined himself in the spotlight like this, but as Clara gave him an encouraging nod, he knew that he couldn't turn back now. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been ignored, underestimated, or forgotten. As he stepped onto the stage, he was greeted by applause. The audience was a sea of faces, journalists, city leaders, and the very people who had been touched by the project. Danny took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, everyone," Danny said, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "I stand before you today as a witness to the stories that have been hidden for far too long, a witness to the power of art, to the power of community, and to the belief that every person, no matter their circumstances, deserves to be seen." Danny's words flowed more easily now, the nervousness fading as he spoke from his heart. He talked about the homeless community, about the struggles and the strength he had witnessed. He talked about how art had helped people express themselves, heal, and find hope. And he spoke about the next phase of the initiative, the city's new commitment to expanding the program and providing resources for the people who needed them the most. By the end of his speech, the applause was thunderous. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the feeling that rippled through the room, that sense of collective responsibility, of people coming together to support those who needed it most. Danny knew the journey was far from over, but in that moment, he felt the weight of the progress they had made. The ripple effect had begun, and it was spreading faster than he had ever imagined. The months after the press conference felt like a blur of constant motion. Danny had stepped into the role of spokesperson for the city's new initiative, and while he still grappled with the spotlight, he couldn't deny the impact the program was having. New workshops were opening every week, the shelters were buzzing with energy, and artists and mental health professionals were working hand in hand to create something truly transformative. But amidst all the excitement, Danny found himself at a crossroads. The scope of the project had expanded beyond his initial vision. It was no longer just about creating art. It was about building a lasting infrastructure, one that could support people beyond the workshops and therapy sessions. It was about securing funding, creating long-term partnerships, and ensuring that the project could thrive without him being at the center of it all. One afternoon, as Danny sat in his office reviewing budget reports and meeting schedules, Clara knocked gently before entering. "How's it going?" she asked, her tone light but filled with concern as she noticed the pile of paperwork in front of him. Danny sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's a lot. I don't know if I'm the right person for all of this. I just wanted to make art. Now I'm a manager, a spokesperson, a fundraiser. I never imagined any of this would get this big." Clara smiled softly, pulling up a chair beside him. "I get it, Danny. I really do. But look at what you've built. You've created something that people believe in. You've inspired an entire city, and more than that, an entire community of people who now have a voice. You're not just making art anymore. You're changing lives." Danny leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. "But I didn't sign up to change the world. I just wanted to make a difference in people's lives, one person at a time." "I know, but sometimes a single act of kindness has a ripple effect that we can't control," Clara said gently. "And now you're in a position where you can help more people than you ever dreamed possible. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the community, about the people who are coming together to support one another. Danny nodded, though a part of him still felt overwhelmed. The project had grown, and with that growth came new responsibilities. He wasn't sure if he was prepared for what lay ahead, but he knew he couldn't turn back. Not now. Too many people were depending on this program, and there was still so much more to be done. The following week, the city held its first ever public showcase of the initiative's work. It was a culmination of months of planning and collaboration, an exhibition that featured the art created by the participants in the workshops, as well as personal stories shared through video and written word. This event was not only a celebration of the project's success, but a statement to the world that people experiencing homelessness were more than just their circumstances. They were artists, dreamers, and storytellers. The gallery was packed. There were rows of paintings on the walls, sculptures placed in every corner, and photographs scattered throughout the space. People stood in front of the artwork, captivated by the stories that each piece told. Some of the pieces were vibrant and full of hope, while others were dark and reflective of pain. But all of them spoke of resilience and survival. As Danny walked through the gallery, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was what he had hoped for. This was what he had dreamed of when he first started working with the homeless. To give them the chance to create, to share their stories, and to be seen. The sense of pride and accomplishment in the room was palpable, and he could see how deeply the participants were moved by the recognition. At the far end of the room, Joe was standing with his arms crossed, staring at a large painting he had created for the showcase. It was a colorful, abstract piece that depicted a journey from darkness to light. As Danny approached, Joe turned to him with a grin. "You like it?" Joe asked, his voice filled with pride. Danny smiled. "I love it, Joe. It's incredible. You've come so far." Joe nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't easy, but I feel like I'm finally telling my story, and it feels good. It feels real." Danny placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. "This is just the beginning, man. You've got so much more to share with the world." Joe's eyes brightened, his voice softening. "You helped me get here, Danny. You gave me a chance to be seen. And now, I'm ready to help others do the same." The night of the showcase ended in a flurry of emotions. The media coverage was overwhelming, with multiple news outlets reporting on the success of the project and the artists who had participated. But what stood out the most for Danny was the moment when he looked around the room and realized that everything he had worked for was no longer just his dream. It had become a shared dream, one that had touched so many people's lives. The following days were filled with meetings with city officials, donors, and community leaders. But despite the hectic schedule, Danny found himself feeling more energized than ever. He had always believed in the power of art, but now, he was seeing firsthand how it could bring people together to create real, lasting change. It wasn't just about one person's journey anymore. It was about a collective effort to shift the narrative around homelessness, mental health, and human connection. And while Danny knew there was still so much work to be done, so many more communities to reach and so many more lives to touch, he also knew that the foundation had been laid. The movement was no longer just a project. It was a force that had already begun to change the city and the world in ways that were impossible to predict. One afternoon, as Danny sat at a local cafe with Clara, he received an unexpected phone call. He glanced at the screen, surprised to see an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" he answered, unsure who it could be. "Danny, it's Thomas Hayes. I've been thinking about something." Dr. Hayes's voice came through the line. "We've had some incredible success with the workshops and therapy programs, but there's another step we can take. What if we expanded this idea beyond the city? What if we could start a nationwide initiative that helps homeless communities around the country?" Danny's heart skipped a beat. A nationwide initiative? It was a big ask, but something about it felt right. "I've always believed in this, but I never imagined it could grow this fast." "You've created something that works, Danny. People need this, and I think we have the resources to take it to the next level. We just need to think bigger." Danny looked across the table at Clara, who raised an eyebrow, sensing the weight of the conversation. "What do you think, Clara?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Clara smiled, her eyes filled with conviction. "I think it's time for the next chapter. Let's do it." And with that, the spark for something even bigger was lit. Danny had started a movement. But now, It was time to turn that movement into a nationwide force for change. The city had changed. Danny could feel it in the air. Something had shifted. The energy was different now. The art, the workshops, the therapy sessions, all of it had sparked a revolution of sorts, one that had grown beyond any of their expectations. But as Danny and Clara stood on the rooftop of a building overlooking the city, the realization hit him. This was just the beginning. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The bustling city below seemed almost quiet from up here, the sounds of traffic and chatter dimming as the evening descended. Clara stood beside him, looking out over the skyline. It was a peaceful moment, yet one filled with the weight of everything they had built together. "Look at it, Danny," Clara said softly. "All of this, everything we've done, it's changing lives." Danny nodded, a sense of awe settling in his chest. He had spent so many years focused on his art, creating in solitude, but now he was part of something much larger. He was part of a movement that was touching lives, not just through the art, but through the compassion, the healing, and the collective effort of the community. People were coming together to break down barriers, to show that homelessness was not just a problem to be solved, but a human issue that deserved empathy and respect. But there was one thing that had always remained at the heart of it all: the belief that every person, no matter their circumstances, had the right to be seen, to be heard, and to be loved. As the nationwide initiative began to take shape, Danny knew that there was still so much to do. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was uncertain. But now, he felt more prepared than ever. He had a team, a network of people who shared the same vision, who understood the power of compassion and creativity. Together, they were going to make this vision a reality. A few weeks later, Danny found himself standing on stage once again. But this time it was different. This wasn't a local showcase, a press conference, or a small gathering. This was the launch of the nationwide initiative, a bold new step in their mission to bring art, mental health support, and community healing to homeless populations across the country. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: politicians, philanthropists, mental health professionals, artists, and advocates, all gathered to witness the next phase of the project that had already begun to transform so many lives. Danny's heart raced as he stepped up to the podium, but this time, he felt something new. It wasn't fear. It was a quiet confidence, a belief in the work that had been done, and a hope for what was to come. "Thank you, everyone, for being here today," Danny began, his voice steady as he looked out over the crowd. "When I first started working with people who were experiencing homelessness, I had no idea what it would become. All I knew was that I wanted to give them a voice, to show that they are more than their circumstances, that they are artists, creators, and survivors. But what I've learned along the way is that this is bigger than any one person. This is about all of us coming together to change the way we see and treat each other." Danny paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. "I've seen the power of art, of healing, of community," he continued. "I've seen how people who were once invisible have stepped into the light, how they've taken ownership of their stories and their lives. And now, we're going to take this movement to the next level. We're going to take it nationwide. We're going to create spaces for healing, for self-expression, and for community in cities across this country. Because every person deserves a chance to be seen. Every person deserves to have their voice heard." The room was silent, hanging on every word. Danny could feel the energy in the room shift, as if the weight of his words was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. A call to everyone in that room to step up and be part of the solution. Over the next year, the nationwide initiative expanded rapidly. New workshops were launched in cities across the country, and the partnerships with local shelters, mental health organizations, and community leaders grew stronger. Danny traveled from one city to the next, speaking to local governments, meeting with artists, and facilitating art therapy workshops. Everywhere he went, he was met with the same response. People wanted to be part of the movement. They wanted to help. And while the initiative was making waves in big cities, the smaller, often overlooked communities were not forgotten. The team worked hard to ensure that the program was accessible to people everywhere, regardless of their location or socioeconomic status. No one was left behind. One of the most powerful moments for Danny came during a visit to a rural town in the Midwest. The community there had been hit hard by economic downturns and had struggled with a high rate of homelessness. At first, Danny wasn't sure how the program would be received. The town was small, conservative, and hadn't been exposed to many of the progressive ideas that had gained traction in larger cities. But when Danny walked into the local shelter and saw the faces of the people there, something clicked. These were people just like everyone else, people with dreams, with stories, with untapped potential. And when he started the art therapy session, he saw the same transformation he had witnessed in the larger cities. People opened up. They created. They healed. By the end of the week, the town was on board. Local leaders were excited to keep the program going, and volunteers were stepping up to help. The ripple effect had spread far beyond the boundaries of the city. It had reached a rural community that needed it just as much. As the years passed, Danny watched as the movement continued to grow. The partnerships expanded, the workshops flourished, and more lives were touched by the healing power of art. But what made him the most proud wasn't just the success of the program. It was the change he saw in people, the way they looked at one another, the way they viewed homelessness, mental health, and community. People no longer saw homelessness as a problem to be solved. They saw it as a human issue that required empathy, compassion, and action. Danny's life had changed in ways he never expected. From the homeless man who had asked him for $1 to the national initiative that had sparked a movement, everything had come full circle. And while he was proud of everything they had accomplished, he knew there was still more work to be done. The journey was ongoing, and he was just one piece of the puzzle. But as Danny stood on stage at a national conference, speaking to a packed auditorium about the impact of the program, he couldn't help but think about where it all began. It had started with one person, one interaction, one act of kindness. And now, it had grown into a legacy of hope. As the crowd cheered, Danny looked out over the audience, his heart swelling with pride. He had started this journey to help others find their voice, but in the process, he had found his own. And that was the most powerful story of all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What part of this story resonated with you the most? How can you use your voice and your actions to make a difference? Together, we can build a world where every person has the chance to be seen, heard, and loved.